The servant approaches the Duke and asks what business he wished to discuss with him. Klaus de Balthasar is the Duke of the Luke-Belset Empire. The man rises abruptly and, approaching the servant, presses him against the wall, because he wants to make sure of something. Inhaling the scent emanating from the servant, he reminds him that he already ordered him not to wear that perfume. And although Antonio de Jessen claims not to wear perfume, the Duke thinks he speaks with too much insolence for someone who works for him due to debts. Klaus is good at solving riddles, and he is firmly determined to unravel the secret the servant keeps. Drops of sweat appear on Antonio's face. He doesn't understand if it's possible that the Duke guessed that he is actually a woman. Klaus advises the servant not to try to hide from him, as the more he thinks about it, the deeper he wants to delve. Roselia disguised herself as a man to change the course of the original story. But it seems it turned out to be difficult in the end. 3 months ago, the protagonist was in the middle of the room, watching her half-brother smash empty bottles. He demanded that Roselia bring him something to drink immediately, as all the alcohol in the house had run out. Roselia de Hessen, the adopted daughter of Baron Hessen, listened silently to her brother's shouts. He couldn't understand why the girl had no money, since her father must have left her something. Looking at Antonio, Roselia remembered that he spent it all, but he demanded that she then sell something valuable. Baron Jessen fell ill and died, after which the entire family fortune collapsed. And his son, who should have prevented it, instead behaved like an animal. The heroine approached the table, picked up the sharp dagger lying there, and headed towards Antonio. And although the brother, trembling, begged Roselia not to approach, she was determined to end this. Antonio closed his eyes and screamed in terror, covering his face with his hands. But the blow never landed. Upon opening his eyes, he noticed that Roselia had cut her hair. It was the only valuable thing she had left, so she suggested that her brother take it and flee. Antonio, grabbing the hair, turned around and left the house, calling her an evil creature as farewell. It didn't even affect the protagonist, as if her life were at stake, it could be much worse. Roselia knew Antonio wouldn't come back, as the loan sharks were waiting outside. It is unknown if they killed him or not, because the character never appeared again in the story. Although the clothes were a bit too big, Roselia put them on, rolling up the sleeves a bit. Thus she obtained a new identity, becoming Antonio de Jessen to change her destiny. Roselia de Jessen was just an extra who dedicated her life to serving the Duke, only to die. To her misfortune, the heroine reincarnated right into that body, and she knows the Duke will come looking for her as a servant. 3 years have passed since she arrived here, and since then, the girl has been preparing for this moment. She does not intend to die as written in the original plot, where the heroine falls in love with the Duke. There are many other ways to pay debts, and there is no need to resort to Klaus de Balthasar and fall in love with him. Just as in the original plot, the Duke arrived at Baron Hessen's estate. The estate looks quite dilapidated, as it hasn't been maintained for a long time, and even if Klaus sold it, he wouldn't get half the amount he lent the Baron. The Duke's assistant, Alejandro, reads a report indicating that the estate was inherited by Antonio, the eldest son of Jessen. Furthermore, according to the document, the Baron has a daughter named Roselia. Baron Jessen himself passed away a few days ago due to a serious illness. At that very moment, the heroine, dressed in men's attire, comes out to meet the Duke and introduces herself as the Baron's eldest son, Antonio de Jessen. The young man extends his hand to the Duke, but he does not return the greeting. He coldly announces that he has come to collect a debt of 5,000 berangs from the father. The heroine is shocked by how the Baron could have borrowed such an enormous sum, enough to buy 3 mansions. The Duke wants to know how Antonio plans to repay the rest of the money, since, by selling the estate, they will barely raise 3,000. The boy confirms his suspicion that, at this moment, he does not have that amount, but he begs for only 1 year, promising that, during that time, he will pay the entire debt without fail. After a brief silence, the Duke asks how Antonio intends to achieve this. He heard rumors that the boy was expelled from the academy and has become a hopeless drunkard. According to Antonio, he hasn't just been loafing around the alleys. He has an ace up his sleeve. Although he doesn't say it out loud, his strength lies in knowing the plot of this novel. The heroine knows the location of the crystal mines, which in the story's timeline will be discovered in 6 months. Furthermore, she knows the location of a sunken ship full of jewels. But the easiest way to get money is art. The passion of the crown princess. She found famous artists, pushed them to stardom and made a fortune, and the heroine just needs to find them first. Antonio declares that he will use the information gathered in the alleys and his sharp eye to acquire works of art. It sounds plausible to the Duke, but he still doesn't understand with what money the boy plans to buy them. The question seems logical to Antonio, as every business needs initial capital. That's why he wants to go to the Duke and ask to borrow only 20 barangs. Klaus glares at the boy and ponders. Antonio begs him to trust him and lend him the money just once. He promises to show him the magic of turning 20 barangs into 500 in just 2 months. Although doubts torment Klaus, he decides to lend the money to the brat. But on one condition. Antonio didn't even see 2 huge men coming who grabbed him by the arms. Frightened, the boy struggles and begs to be released, insisting that he will pay, yes. Or yes. The Duke does not fully trust Antonio. He believes he is only filling him with empty promises. He asks where the boy will live until he pays the debt, once the property is sold. The protagonist freezes. She hadn't thought of that. Klaus decides to trust Antonio's word, but he will repay the money under his supervision. Until he pays the full amount, he will have to serve in the Duke's mansion. The heroine despairs. She tried so hard to avoid being the Duke's servant, and now she is an undercover servant. In the Duchy of Baltasar, Antonio was given a room too good for a servant. According to Alejandro, the reason for this is that the Lord of Jessen is in a slightly different position compared to the other servants. Although Antonio is a servant of the ducal house, at the same time, he remains a business partner of the Duke. And furthermore, this room is 5 steps away from the study of the Lord of Baltasar. The man suggests following him to show Antonio the entire property. The only thing that cheers the heroine up in this situation is that she won't have to spend the night in the common room for male servants. As she explores the property, the girl feels how difficult it is for her to breathe because of how tightly she has bandaged her chest. At that moment, a young lady rushes past, stumbles when she bumps into the new servant, and falls directly into his arms. The girl is incredibly light, like a cloud, with a grunt of displeasure. She asks the boy how long he is going to keep holding her like that. When Antonio lets her go, he realizes that the person in front of him must be Klaus's sister, Closet de Baltasar. Upon learning that he is her new servant, the girl examines him closely and comments that he is quite handsome. And since Closet loves beautiful things, from today on she intends to make him her household pet. Lately, the fashion of having an attractive servant as an ornament has spread among noble ladies. Antonio fails to reply when Closet's personal maid appears in the hallway, after ordering the servant to be ready to accompany her to a meeting tomorrow. The girl flees from the maid. Antonio, in shock, stands still, unable even to object. Alejandro, however, calls him lucky, as attracting the attention of a lady on the first day is a great privilege. At night, the protagonist collapses on the bed and reflects on the day she had. She has no time to accompany this young lady, who seems to be an incredibly selfish person. She must repay the Duke 500 barangs in 2 months, or de Jessen will pay dearly. By the way, Alejandro should have already brought the 20 barangs promised by the Duke. But for some reason, he hasn't appeared yet. The protagonist is anxious to find some peace of mind. After all, it's her first day in the Duke's mansion. She feels very uncomfortable and wants to take off this tight bandage, even for a moment. It is already very late, and Alejandro will most likely come tomorrow. Untying her chest, the protagonist collapses on the bed, happy to finally breathe. The girl relaxes, believing no one could appear in her room at this hour. However, at that very moment, a knock is heard at the door, and the protagonist, startled, jumps out of bed like lightning. Grabbing the bandages lying nearby, she tries to bandage her chest, but due to the rush, she doesn't do it very well. Deciding that Alejandro is behind the door, the protagonist opens it slightly. But as she peeks out, she discovers the Duke in front of her. It turns out the assistant had errands to attend to, and that's why Callus came to deliver the money in person. Upon entering the room, the Duke doesn't understand why Antonio is clinging to that huge vase. The servant explains that it was in the way, and that he simply wanted to move it from its spot. Klaus extends the envelope with the promised money to the boy, but he cannot receive it. Since his hands are full, Antonio refuses the offer to put the vase somewhere, stating that he hasn't thought of a suitable place for it yet. He suggests placing the envelope right under the plant. The next day, as planned, Closet leaves for the reception in the company of the new servant. Unexpectedly, she apologizes to Antonio. She is irritated that her brother worries so much about money that he shows no understanding. Therefore, she, as a representative of the duchy, apologizes on his behalf. And although Antonio insists that she shouldn't, Closet thinks all this is wrong. She is sure that Klaus will run into serious trouble one day. Then, Closet smiles and asks Antonio not to worry, because as long as he is with her, no one will bother him. The girl promises to protect him, as he will now be part of her personal service. At night, Closet invites Antonio to dinner together, although he doubts this is allowed for servants. The girl sees nothing wrong with it. After all, he is an aristocrat. As soon as she utters these words, she realizes that Klaus is standing behind her. Without saying a word to her brother, Closet turns around and calls Antonio to follow her. The Duke observes that the boy seems quite calm. He asks if Antonio has already gathered 500 barangs, since he has time to hang around with his sister. In response, he reminds him that the Duke gave him 2 months to do it. Klaus thinks that even if Antonio starts right now, he doubts he will manage to gather all the money. The boy asks him not to worry about that, not forgetting to mention that he is now a servant in this house, and he cannot disobey the lady's orders. Having said that, Antonio withdraws with a bow. Deep down, the heroine is irritated by the Duke's arrogant tone, who believes his threatening gaze can scare anyone. When Antonio turns to leave, he doesn't see a servant carrying a vase with flowers. They collide, and the water from the vase spills over him. Closet rushes to Antonio to make sure he hasn't hurt himself. The boy claims he is fine and only needs to change clothes. Suddenly, the Duke's voice is heard from behind, asking Antonio if he is injured. When Jason's clothes get wet, a bandage becomes visible under his shirt. Covering her chest with her hands, the heroine desperately tries to invent an excuse. Meanwhile, the Duke keeps insisting on knowing why he needs the bandage if Antonio is not injured. The heroine feels the intense gazes of Klaus and Closet, but no justification comes to mind. And at that moment, Lady de Balthasar suddenly declares that Antonio was hurt because of her. According to Closet, she slipped recently while getting out of the carriage, and the boy rushed to help her. But he ended up falling. The lie is so convincing that the Duke has no doubt about her words. Looking at the girl, the heroine mentally thanks her for her help. However, when she meets Closet's gaze, for a moment it seems like she has guessed everything. Since Antonio was hurt because of his sister, the Duke apologizes for it. However, Closet gets angry with him for it, indignant why Klaus should apologize for her. And when the Duke asks if she has hurt herself, she asks sarcastically, since when does her condition matter to him? At that instant, the protagonist feels like she is between two wild tigers ready to attack each other. Turning to leave, the Duke advises Antonio not to overdo it, because until he pays his debts, his body does not belong to him. As he leaves, Chloe gets angry with her brother. Astonished by how he can say such things, Antonio asks the lady why she helped him. According to Chloe, she did it because at that moment the boy's face showed great distress. And that is because she promised to protect Antonio from that ruthless tyrant. Chloe doesn't care at all why he is wearing that bandage. Perhaps Antonio has scars he doesn't want to show anyone, or any other reason. But he was definitely having a hard time. Suddenly remembering something, Closet turns back to Jason. Soon there will be tea at the Marquis's daughter's house, and he will just have to stay by her side. And be handsome, so now he must change into dry clothes so as not to catch a cold. The next day, Roselia, in her usual guise as Antonio, arrives at Algris. Right in the center of this small town is the first painting she plans to acquire. In the original story, the protagonist found the first work of art here, and from then on, she began to support unknown artists. Somewhere around here, in the market square, there should be a man selling paintings. However, no matter how much Antonio searches, he cannot find him. An old woman selling vegetables asks the boy if he is looking for something specific. Antonio asks her if there is a man selling paintings around here. The woman thinks he means Abelio, but she hasn't seen him in a long time. If the boy is so interested in where the artist went, he could go to his house and find out for himself. The woman mentioned that there are roses at Abelio's door. And after a while, the protagonist finally finds the correct house. She knocks on the door insistently, but for some reason no one answers. Convinced that the artist must be in that town, she knocks on the door and demands that they open up. Finally, the door opens, and the owner of the house demands an explanation for what is happening. Abel Wen-tan wants to know who this person is, who dares to knock on his door so insistently. At that very moment, Antonio spots a painting behind him. It depicts a woman and a little girl in a garden of blooming roses, and it perfectly matches the original, confirming that he arrived at the right place. Antonio, using all his charm, asks if Mr. Abelo lives there. He says he stumbled upon a work by the artist, and now he has come to meet him in person. But Antonio fails to introduce himself. The door slams shut in his face. He begins to bang on the door again, begging Mr. Abelo to just talk. Suddenly, Antonio notices a blonde girl watching him from the corner of the house. But as soon as the little girl sees she's been discovered, she turns around and runs away. Crouching down beside her, Antonio asks if she lives in that house and why she is walking alone. But her mother forbade her to talk to strangers, and now she remembers she shouldn't have gotten excited while being a man. Apologizing for scaring the girl, Antonio gets up and promises to leave immediately. But he hears the little girl crying behind him. Now, looking around, he understands that the house is abandoned and no one is taking care of the girl. Meanwhile, the Duke arrives in Algris, accompanied by his assistant. Alejandro doesn't understand why his lordship decided to build a school in such a small town. But Klaus believes it is not a simple town, since merchants traveling between the capital and the duchy avoid it. As everything is concentrated in the capital, this city is also growing, and in the future it will develop even more. And since there is already an academy for the aristocracy, it is best to build a school for the middle class. And peasants, Alejandro is amazed by the incredible mind of his lord, who was once the best in the academy. Just as the Duke suggests taking a look at the market, Antonio passes through the same square behind him. He stops in front of the window of a shop selling women's wigs. Meanwhile, Abelo drinks another bottle of wine, and his little daughter Erlin sits by the window watching the courtyard. Suddenly, she notices a beautiful blonde woman heading towards her house. Mistaking her for her mother, Erlin jumps off the chair and runs at full speed towards the door. Running into the courtyard, she throws herself into the arms of the disguised heroine, who really resembles her mother in appearance. Abelo comes out behind the girl, apologizing to the young woman for the confusion. He tries to explain to little Erlin that she is not her mom at all. Calming his crying daughter, Abelo explains that his wife died very recently. Roselia smiles and asks him not to apologize. A month later, Abelo was supposed to meet the protagonist, the princess, at the market. As Roselia correctly supposed, he obviously saw his late wife in the princess. For that reason, just in case, he decided to wear a wig the same color as the princess's hair. Approaching Erlin, the heroine regrets that the girl mistook her for her mother. Looking closely at the young woman, the little girl replies that everything is fine. According to her, her mother had beautiful blue eyes, but upon approaching, she sees they don't look alike at all. Erlin turns to her father and asks impatiently, "When will Mom finally return?" With a heavy heart, the protagonist watches as Abelo feeds false hope to his daughter. Asking for patience, the artist apologizes to the stranger for the scene and wants to know what she is doing near his humble dwelling. Because the girl doesn't look like someone who would accidentally get lost in a neighborhood like this. Absorbed in the painting, the protagonist did not foresee this question and now tries to invent a credible excuse. But at that very instant, Abelo asks her if she has come to buy one of his masterpieces. He assumes the young woman came with that guy who was snooping around here moments before her arrival. Before she can utter a word, the artist invites her inside the house to chat quietly. After offering her tea, Abelo apologizes for the state of his home, which unfortunately is not optimal. The heroine praises the exquisite aroma of the tea, while glancing at the painting behind the artist. This does not escape Abelo's attention, who assumes that the girl obviously loved the painting. To the question of who that boy Antonio is, the heroine replies that he is her older brother. Looking at his daughter, the artist sighs heavily and recounts that this painting is his last work after his wife's death. Since finishing it, he hasn't painted anything else, nor has he even gone out on the street. However, seeing how Erling ran to meet the girl a few minutes ago, Abelio understood something. He realized that not only was he left alone, but not only he had suffered all this time. Until that moment, the man did not understand that his daughter had had it even harder. After a brief silence, Abelo suddenly declares that he will sell that painting to the girl. The heroine wants to know if he is sure, since it seems this work is very important to him. The artist believes he has been too selfish. He got stuck on this picture and couldn't move forward. However, it was foolishness. After all, it's just a drawing. He must react for his daughter, sell this painting, and with the money buy clothes and take better care of the baby, because that is exactly what his wife would want. Furthermore, Abelo wants to thank the girl and her brother Antonio, because thanks to them he reacted. The heroine finds these words hard to hear, as she knows that even if she hadn't gone today, she would have met the princess at the market and recovered. She assures the artist that his painting will be recognized as a work of art. And although Abelio doesn't understand where she gets that confidence, the girl replies that it is a masterpiece, and people will recognize its value. The heroine knows perfectly well that, according to the plot, this artist will receive support from the royal family and continue to create masterpieces. After acquiring the painting, Roselia returns to the market square, planning her next moves. Absorbed in her thoughts, she bumps into someone's back without looking. After falling to the ground, the girl apologizes without looking up at the passerby. When the man turns around and asks if she hurt herself, she discovers the Duke. Hiding behind the painting, she desperately tries to think what to do now. The Duke doesn't understand why she is hiding her face and insists on knowing if she is hurt. But she suddenly, without answering and hidden behind the painting, runs away. Alejandro asks why she fled so fast. Does the Duke know her? Klaus smiles and denies knowing her, but confesses that her eyes seemed familiar. Back at the Baltasar mansion, she looks around cautiously and relaxes. The girl doesn't understand why they had to meet just when she was dressed like this. She approaches the Duke's door to see if he has returned. And just then, Klaus appears from behind. He opens the door and asks what Antonio needs from him. Trying to look as casual as possible, he replies that he needs nothing. However, the Duke informs him that in that case, he has bad news, as he does have something to tell the boy. Klaus enters the office and calls Antonio to follow him so they can talk. According to the Duke, the boy had told him that his younger sister, Roselia de Hessen, had died, but today he met someone identical to her, like 2 drops of water. Approaching the boy closely, the Duke adds that the same scent emanated from the woman he met today. Antonio pretends not to understand absolutely anything the Lord of Baltasar is talking about, but he insists, persistently asking if Roselia is really dead. Because if Antonio lied and hid his sister secretly, he will be in serious trouble for it. Only now does the protagonist realize that the Duke never understood that she was actually that girl. This man was always this cold and expressionless. He used Roselia, who loved him immeasurably, and then simply discarded her. And in the end, the girl met a cruel death. Mustering courage, Antonio declares that the Duke is saying unfounded things. Besides, such words should not be said to a grieving brother. He and Roselia are not blood relatives. When they were younger, Roselia's mother married the Baron, her father, and brought her daughter with her. And since there is no blood relation between them, they cannot resemble each other at all. Admitting that he must have been mistaken, the Duke turns around and lets Antonio go. But before the boy reaches the door, Klaus decides to add something else. According to him, if this is all a farce, he has no choice but to applaud Antonio. De Jessen gives him a fleeting look and leaves the office in dead silence. Alone, Klaus reproaches himself for his reckless behavior. He blames that strange scent. Upon entering his room, the protagonist is glad she did so well. She got the painting she wanted so much, and now all that remains is to resell it. The problem is how to do it. She can't figure out how to get the princess to see the painting. Closet notices that Antonio is worried and offers him her unconditional help. Today you must shine more than anyone. You cannot be this downcast, she tells him. Antonio smiles at her insistence, and the girl gets angry because he underestimates her. De Jessen admits that even for Closet it will be difficult, because to pay the debts, he must first meet Her Highness the Princess. Hearing this, Lady Baltasar declares that there is nothing special about it. Smiling, she asks if Antonio knows where the afternoon tea will be held. Looking out the window, De Jessen is surprised to discover that they are approaching the princess's family home. During the tea, Antonio earned the admiration of the young noblewomen invited to the event. He gave an excellent hairstyle to Ikelia de Herden, the younger sister of the crown princess of the house of the Marquis of Herden. Everyone admires Antonio's talent and incredible beauty. Closet proudly confirms that, indeed, he belongs to a rare type of handsome man. And only Eusit de Belmont, the young lady of the Marquis's family, snorts in discontent. In her opinion, someone so fragile cannot be a real servant, as they could fall apart even with a light touch. Closet starts getting angry, ready for a fight, but Antonio assures the lady that everything is fine. He approaches Lady Jusit and, introducing himself courteously, asks permission to fix her hair. At his words, the girl blushes instantly. Completely red, the protagonist knows perfectly how to deal with these individuals, as arrogant people like her usually surrender to kindness. Antonio insists that a high hairstyle will best bring out Lady Juicet's features. The girls sitting at the table marvel at how easily this boy managed to calm Yusei. Not missing the opportunity, Closet declares that those are not all of Antonio's talents. He has exquisite taste. According to her, he is very interested in painting and has such a sharp eye for art that even the Duke recognizes it. Closet asks Lady Herden if it's true that her sister is also interested in paintings, and Kelia confirms it, and she says that the princess recently invited several artists to the palace, but it seems she hasn't found a painting she likes yet. Seizing the moment, Closet reveals that Antonio acquired a painting that the princess might like, and that Elia promises to tell her sister, hoping that at least this time something will truly please her. Closet looks at Antonio and discreetly signals to him that everything went perfectly. And so, just 2 days later, the protagonist enters the imperial palace, holding a below on Tom's painting tightly. Finally, after 3 years living in this body, she will meet the crown princess herself. With some nervousness, she approaches the door behind which the novel's heroine is located. Ibelian de Luc Belsit smiles and greets D'Antonio, who informs her that he has something he would like to show her. The young man is completely dazzled by the princess's beauty. Feeling indescribable joy upon meeting the novel's protagonist, he bows and declares that it is a great honor. Ibelian asks Antonio to raise his head, since Closet is like a little sister to her. Since she praised that painting so much, she became very curious to see that work of art. When Antonio unpacks the painting and places it on the easel, the princess stares at it intently for a while. Ibelian remains silent for so long that the protagonist begins to worry. But suddenly, the princess turns and, smiling, summarizes that the painting is really very pleasant. She feels as if she can perceive the emotions of the woman portrayed in it. Relieved that Her Highness appreciated the painting, Antonio reveals the artist's name. Abelo Hantem. Ibelian thanks de Jessen for introducing her to this incredible work of art. Immediately afterwards, she informs Antonio that she wants to make him an offer. As is well known, princesses have quite limited freedom of movement, and although she loves paintings, she finds it difficult to find truly good examples since she cannot leave the palace. So she asks Antonio for a favor, trusting his expert eye for art, and promises to pay him a fair price for it. And Belian wants de Hessen to continue finding and presenting these masterpieces to her, to which he gladly agrees. But first of all, the princess has to set the price for this painting. When Her Highness's maid brings a check on a tray, the heroine is expectant, since she knows that in the original story, Ibelian paid 500 barangs for this painting. However, upon seeing the check, Antonio exclaims in surprise, asking if the princess hasn't made a mistake in the amount, since 1,000 barangs are listed there. According to Ibelian, this sum includes not only the price of the painting, but also a bribe. Because she wants de Jessen to keep bringing her works of art, the heroine literally radiates joy, because, perhaps, she will manage to settle her debt much faster. At that moment, the princess is informed that His Highness, the Crown Prince, has arrived to visit her. Antonio bows respectfully, and Ibelian doesn't miss noticing him at that instant. This man with brilliant golden hair and eyes like sunlight possesses a rough temperament. Esteban Vandalov de Lugbelzit, the crazy protagonist of the novel, always mocked the princess, and only at the end of the story will he regret it and begin to change. With fear in her eyes and staring at him, Ibelian explains that she invited Antonio to ask about Closet's well-being. Esteban is interested in knowing what the crown princess is plotting this time, as it is strange that she invited a ducal servant just to know the status of a certain aristocrat. He suspects that the girl is maintaining secret contact with the ducal family. Klaus de Balthasar and Ibelian were friends since early childhood. In fact, these two were so close that it was impossible to separate them. However, everything changed when the crown prince got between them, and it reached the point where they began to despise each other. With arms crossed and an ironic smile, Esteban wants to know what Ibelian is plotting by contacting the duchy behind her back. He won't believe the story that the crown princess simply wanted to know how Closet is doing. Ibelian demands that he directly tell her what exactly he suspects her of. The prince believes that his home marquisate and the Duke's family could be conspiring against him. Esteban thinks Ibelion seems to have something to hide, but she begs him to stop. Taking his fiancée's hand, the prince asks what he will do if he doesn't stop. Because if she plans to drive him to suicide, like her mother, unfortunately he is not that weak. In the original novel, this happened constantly. The accumulated doubts and misunderstandings united into a great catastrophe. The only thing missing was Klaus, suddenly appearing and making everything worse with his arrival. And at that very instant, when the protagonist thinks about this, the Duke appears in the room. Releasing Ibelion's hand from Esteban's grip, he calmly asks His Highness to cease. The protagonist doesn't understand why this is happening precisely now, with her present. According to the Crown Prince, the Duke of Baltasar appeared just in time. With a malicious smile, he comments that next to those two, he seems like the villain. After these words, Klaus and he get into an argument, until Ibelion screams for them to stop. Otherwise, she threatens not to show up at the next diplomatic meeting. Since the Crown Princess insists, Esteban decides to leave, as it would be a great loss if Ibelion, with her great intuition, did not attend such an important event. But before leaving, he adds that if the Duke crosses his path again, his family will regret it. When Esteban leaves, Klaus asks why Ibelion still allows the Crown Prince to treat her like that. The young woman indignantly replies that it is none of his business at all. And it is only now that the Duke realizes that Antonio has been there the whole time. Turning to a servant, he asks what he is doing there. The Crown Princess, who hides her plan to collect art with Antonio, replies for him saying that she called the servant to ask about closet. The Duke asks if Antonio intends to stay there until he tells him to leave. Upon leaving the room, the protagonist wonders if Klaus thought she was there voluntarily. As soon as Antonio leaves the palace, the Crown Prince calls him from a corner. The servant pretends not to hear anything, but Esteban persistently pursues him. Antonio turns around and, pretending to just see him, asks what he wants from a humble servant like him. Looking around to avoid prying eyes, Esteban grabs the boy by the neck. The prince drags the servant to a garden where no one can hear them. Pressing him against the wall, Esteban asks him what order he received from the Duke, whether he should spy or observe. He promises to release Antonio if he answers truthfully, but the young man insists that he was not ordered anything. The Crown Prince insists and promises to pay 2, or even 3 times more than the Duke. Undoubtedly, the offer to betray Klaus and earn money from it is quite tempting, but Antonio remains firm, assuring that he is only there to fulfill an order. Nothing more. Thinking a little, Esteban suddenly grabs the servant by the arm, surprised at how thin his wrist is. It seems strange to him that Antonio is so short and thin. He asks the servant his name, and memories of the original plot arise in the heroine's mind. Then the Crown Prince, upon hearing the Duke's lackey's name, Roselia, ordered the guard to seize her. The girl was arrested and taken to the guillotine, and all her pleas to Klaus for her salvation were useless. As Antonio remains silent, absorbed in his thoughts, the Crown Prince begins to lose patience. This man, in the original story, was the cause of Roselia's death. The girl was caught spying on an important conversation on the Duke's orders, and ended up in front of the guillotine. Finally gathering her thoughts, the servant tells Esteban her name. According to the prince, that name doesn't suit the boy at all, and he asks why he is so skinny. Antonio explains that he grew up without the possibility of eating well. As for his short stature, he is embarrassed to talk about it, because it is his biggest complex. Finally, the Crown Prince allows Antonio to leave. Back at the Baltasar Duchy, the servant enters Klaus's office and offers him an envelope with double the promised sum. Antonio is curious to know what the Duke, who didn't believe he would repay the money, will answer. Klaus takes the envelope, but wants to know what Jessen was doing in the princess's palace. He won't believe the story that Closet sent him there, so he demands that he tell him the truth. The Duke forbids using the princess for his own ends. Absolutely not. But Antonio replies that paying the debt is his business, and that Klaus shouldn't interfere. The Duke jumps up furiously and grabs the servant by the vest. How dare you talk about the princess like that? Antonio calmly says that he will not harm Ibelion, and that Klaus should not misrepresent him, as it puts him in a difficult position. As soon as he pays the debt, he will leave. And if that was all, he should let him go now. Although the heroine appears calm on the outside, inside, rage consumes her. The Duke used and discarded Roselia. He didn't even defend the one who took the blame. When Klaus is branded a traitor and they want to execute him, she won't lift a finger. On the contrary, she will smile radiantly, celebrating that he is paying for what he did. And this time, he will be the one to die for his obsession with the princess. After leaving the Duke's mansion, Antonio goes shopping with Closet, who is looking for a new mask. She notices that Dejessen is worried, and jokes that it seems all the family debts have fallen on him. Antonio smiles at this cruel joke, but quite amused. Closet is very perceptive, so she immediately deduces that Klaus is the cause of his bad mood. Upon learning of the problem, the girl advises Antonio not to pay attention to him, because the Duke becomes unbearable around the princess. In her opinion, he should now focus only on the job he already accepted. Closet hands a mask to Antonio and suggests he try it on. He says the mask doesn't suit his style, so Lady de Balthasar decides to create a custom style for him. Closet has always been curious to see Antonio dressed as a woman. The young woman insists that, after everything she has done for him, he could indulge her whim at least once. Standing in the booth, wearing a wig and dress, she wonders how the hell she got here. Upon emerging into the living room, Closet and Melda are dumbfounded by what they see. Closet believes Antonio must have been born a woman. She is so dazzling that she would have him painted. The only bad thing is that the wig was blonde. Lady de Balthasar thinks dark hair would suit him better. Closet hands a huge pile of masks to Antonio and asks him to try them all on. Soon it will be her birthday masquerade ball, and she even sent an invitation to the princess. Now Closet wants Antonio to attend the banquet, but as a guest, not as a subordinate. Dejessen is not convinced by the idea, but she insists that, with a mask, no one will recognize him. A couple of days later, the topic of what Antonio will wear to the ball comes up again. Closet flatly refuses to let him come in his boring work uniform. The maids surround Antonio to take his measurements. Observing the scene, Closet lets out a strange giggle, completely disconcerting Dejessen. Alejandro enters the room to deliver a gift from the Duke to Lady de Balthasar. Reclining on the sofa, Closet opens the jewelry box and takes out a diamond pendant. When the young woman throws the jewelry box far away, Antonio asks why Klaus sent the gift early. According to Closet, her brother, as always, said he would be busy and could not attend. She is not worried at all that this banquet is not only for her birthday, but also for her debut. This cold-blooded man is never worried about family matters. He is only interested in work and money. Klaus has never attended Closet's birthday banquets, much less on the anniversary of their parents' death. The Duke sits in his office, trying to concentrate on work, but Antonio's words, asking him not to ruin everything, drill into his mind. A knock on the door interrupts Klaus's thoughts. Antonio enters the office with a hesitant step. After what happened here a few days ago, there is a palpable awkwardness in the air. Finally gathering courage, Dejessen says he comes on behalf of the lady, who asked him to thank him for the gift. After those words, a strange pause settles in the air. Sensing it, the Duke asks if Antonio has anything else to say. The young man pulls a box from behind his back and replies that, rather, he wants to give him something. Klaus opens the box and finds a mask, but doesn't understand why he needs it. Antonio explains that, although he may not know it, the lady's birthday banquet will be a masquerade ball. According to Klaus, he knows very well. It is the biggest waste of the ducal coffers this year. Feeling brutal discomfort from the Duke's piercing gaze, Antonio musters courage and speaks. He asks if his lordship will attend the event, because it's not a matter of money. It's his sister's birthday and debut. In response, Klaus points to a huge pile of papers resting on his desk towards Antonio. He says he is too busy, that he cannot leave everything and change his schedule for a simple banquet. Closet should understand what he works day and night for, but Antonio insists, trying to make the Duke see that it's not just a banquet or a birthday. The debutante ball is a crucial event for every aristocrat. Contacts are made there, and soulmates are found. The debut is vital for young ladies, and although the lady doesn't say it, Antonio is sure it hurts her very much. Klaus opines that someone who has been on his property for barely a month doesn't know enough to judge that. Closet and he live like this their whole lives, and each takes care of their own affairs. The Duke is sure that he perfectly fulfills all his obligations and provides the best for his sister. Seeing that this man understands absolutely nothing, Antonio declares that he is not doing enough. Closet cares, and a lot, because after their parents' death, Klaus is the only thing she really has left. Upon hearing these words, the Duke instantly darkens. He declares that Antonio is making too much noise and orders him to leave. The servant apologizes for having consumed so much of Lord of Balthasar's precious time, and he retreats with a bow. Remaining alone, Klaus rubs his temples tiredly and then glances at the mask lying on the table. The next day, Alejandro appears before the Duke with a report on the reopening of the investigation into the case of the Jessen family. He hands the documents to Klaus and suggests he examine them personally. The news that the Baron's daughter's death certificate was false is no surprise to the Duke. It remains to be discovered what Antonio is hiding from him. The day of the masquerade ball arrives, and Closet receives congratulations from the guests alongside Antonio. One of the ladies present admires the banquet, magnificently organized as always. Lady Jucet de Belmont, who approaches at that moment, confirms her words and greets the birthday girl. She introduces Closet to her older brother, who warmly greets and congratulates the lady, about whom he says he has heard from his sister. Then, the young Marquis begins to shake Antonio's hand, mistaking him for the Duke of Balthasar. He says he has always dreamed of meeting the Duke in person, and that he came exclusively for that. The Marquis continues to shower de Chassagne with flattery, until Closet finally tells him that he is not the Duke. Taking Antonio by the arm, she introduces him to the guests as her dance partner. The Marquis is very embarrassed, as he thought Closet's partner would be her older brother. He asks when the Duke will arrive, but Jucet interrupts, reproaching her brother for such questions. According to her, everyone knows that his lordship is too busy to attend banquets. Jucet says that Closet is hurt to hear that, and her brother starts apologizing. Looking around and noticing the murmurs, the protagonist understands that they are trying to provoke Closet. With her head down, the girl is in the middle of the hall and hears people commenting on her relationship with her brother. Just as the heroine's heart clenches at the sight of the sad lady, the arrival of the Duke of Balthasar is announced. Klaus comes down the stairs wearing the mask Antonio gave him. Approaching his sister, he apologizes for being late and congratulates her on her 15th birthday. Taking her brother by the arm, Closet replies that Klaus is right on time, as the Belmont wanted to know where he was. The young woman rushes to introduce the Duke to the young Belmont, and the Marquis runs to meet him. Once again, showering the Lord of Balthasar with compliments, the heroine was surprised to see Klaus at the ball. She didn't expect him to come. It seems that conversation did influence the Duke, and her words worked. Klaus turns, as if to say something to Antonio, but the young Marquis doesn't let go. De Jessen smiles and leaves, leaving the whole group chatting in the center of the hall. Jucet looks at the boy walking away, and it seems like something is plotting in her head. Her gaze meets Closet's, and with her expression, she tries to show her how wrong she was. Lady Belmont cannot afford to feel defeated. Taking a glass of wine, she approaches Antonio and proposes a toast to his health. Jucet is determined to snatch away the most valuable thing Closet de Balthasar has. Finishing her glass, she hides a handkerchief in the neckline of her dress. According to Jucet, she is very lucky because she just didn't have anyone to talk to. She suggests to Antonio that they go somewhere quiet to chat for a while. De Jessen looks at his sister Jucet, who is still clinging to him like a shadow, and although he doesn't feel like going anywhere with that girl, he decides to eliminate any factor that might bother Closet, as it is the first time he has seen her so happy. Taking Jucet by the arm, he agrees to go with her to a more secluded place. Already seated on a sofa in one of the halls, Lady Belmont offers Antonio to sit next to her. And although the boy doubts that it is allowed, Jucet reminds him that today he is a guest, not a servant. Sitting on the sofa, Antonio warns that he cannot be absent for long, as he is Lady Closet's companion. However, according to Jucet, 1 minute will be more than enough. Meanwhile, Closet is looking for Antonio in the hall. If he was here just a moment ago, the Duke tells his sister that he saw him leave with the daughter of Marquis Belmont. He doesn't understand why Closet is so surprised. They have every right to chat alone. Elsewhere, Jucet pours more wine for Antonio and confesses that she likes him a lot. She says she fell in love with him since he gave her that hairstyle at that tea party. While the protagonist desperately tries to decide what to do, Jucet moves closer and asks him what Antonio thinks of her. Then, as if by accident, she spills wine on the boy's shirt, and taking out a handkerchief, she asks permission to clean it. Tejessen moves away, saying he must leave, but suddenly feels a terrible dizziness. Taking advantage of the moment, Jucet lays him down on the sofa and positions herself on top. Antonio realizes that the girl put something in his wine. He can't even move. With a mocking smile, Yusit declares that she always hated that conceited brat Closet. Valmont is indignant that she always gets the best of everything. Juicy's hides her pleasure in anticipating Closet's reaction upon learning that she took away her companion and took possession of him. She starts undressing Antonio, who trembles at the thought that she will discover he is a girl. However, Juicy's doesn't manage to take off his shirt because Closet bursts into the room. With gritted teeth, she stares furiously at Lady Belmont, while Antonio fruitlessly begs for help. Juicy screams for Closet to leave immediately and not bother them. But the next instant, Lady Baltazar lunges at her and knocks her down with a sharp blow to the stomach. The heroine watches the events with fascination, without taking her eyes off her beautiful savior. But when Closet leans over Antonio, he loses consciousness. She wakes up in bed a little later, clutches her head, and tries to remember what happened. Closet and Melda are by her side. When Antonio finally remembers everything, Lady Baltazar informs him that she scolded him harshly and threw Yusit out. After saying this, Closet falls silent again and continues to stare fixedly at Dejessen. Finally, the protagonist realizes that both ladies are looking at her body, since she is only wearing a nightgown. Since Antonio's clothes were dirty, Closet and the maid decided to change him. Upon removing the shirt, the deception is discovered, and they see that he is actually a girl. Roselia didn't think she would be discovered like this, and begs them to allow her to explain everything. However, for some reason, it seems to her that the two ladies are not surprised at all. Nevertheless, Closet claims that not only was she surprised, but she was literally stunned. But she doesn't care if he is a boy or a girl, because that doesn't make him a different person. Closet suddenly confesses that she actually thought about how great it would be if Antonio were a girl. Roselia thanks Lady Baltazar, but apologizes for the deception and asks to be allowed to explain everything. Understanding that all this is for her brother, Closet promises to keep the secret. Imelda will do the same, sure that the girl had a good reason. The maid confesses that she actually suspected something, since Antonio behaved too delicately for a boy. Closet is happy that Roselia is a girl, because she has already prepared a dress for her, just as she wanted. Meanwhile, the Duke, who still can't get rid of the persistent Marquis, wonders where Closet went. Quite some time has passed since she went to look for Antonio, but he hasn't returned yet. Suddenly, Klaus observes how his sister drags a girl into the hall. Roselia tries to convince Closet that it's wrong, but she insists, stating that there is nothing to worry about, and everything will be fine. Is she sure that Yusit is surely waiting for Antonio somewhere, like a hungry lioness? Roselia reminds Closet, who is quite cruel to Lady Belmont. Lady Baltazar gets angry and threatens not to help her again. Then, she tries to elicit sympathy, and says that leaving in the middle of her party is mean. Pouting, Closet walks away from Roselia, complaining that only she considered them friends. Roselia smiles and notices that, curiously, the girl has no tears. At that instant, Prince Esteban and Princess Ibelion of Luke Belset are announced to have arrived. Closet approaches the Duke, who asks her where she was and where Antonio is. The girl replies that she felt unwell and returned to her room. Klaus turns and looks at the girl, who is hiding behind a column in the hall. Ibelion interrupts the conversation and congratulates the birthday girl. All those present greet the little son of the Empire, His Highness, the Crown Prince and the Princess. Closet thanks them for honoring her with their presence tonight, despite their occupations. According to Ibelion, they could not miss the birthday of the beloved Lady de Baltasar. While the girls chat, the Duke and the Crown Prince turn in the same direction. Esteban suddenly spots Roselia, who is trying to slip away from the event discreetly. He cuts the girl off, happy that they finally met. Roselia curtsies and greets His Highness the Crown Prince. However, he asks her to set aside formalities, as it is not the first time they have met. The heroine doesn't understand what he means and tries to leave, but Esteban suddenly grabs her hand. He pulls her towards him, preparing to dance, and orders her to stand still and play along. Roselia doesn't understand why he is dancing with her when the Crown Princess is near, but he orders her to be quiet and simply dance. Looking at Esteban, the heroine calls him treacherous for using her to embarrass the princess. The Crown Prince winks at her, noticing that she is quite cunning. Ibelion, outraged, is in the middle of the hall and hears the guests murmuring behind her back that the prince started the dance with another. A stranger. Klaus silently watches the princess's hands tremble. Esteban, meanwhile, tells Roselia that he is also quite clever. To her question of what he means, the prince replies that her wrist is unusually thin. With a smile, he assumes that the Duke of Baltasar has not yet noticed that his servant is a girl. Esteban doesn't know why he is doing this, but promises to keep the secret if she helps him out once. Before the heroine can ask how she should help the prince, he bends her over his elbow and leans towards her. At that instant, Roselia realizes that, from any other angle, that move will look like a kiss. When the dance ends, Esteban whispers to her not to forget her debt. The heroine dreadfully foresees how much he will regret this. The Duke approaches with an expression indicating that he will not remain silent. Esteban protects her and tells Klaus that he will scare her away with that look, unless he wants to dance with her. The Duke, through clenched teeth, orders him to get out of the way. Sarcastically summarizing that Klaus wanted to dance with her, he asks him to moderate his tone. While they argue, the heroine takes the opportunity to try to slip away. The Duke notices and demands that the girl stop. Right now, but Roselia lifts her skirt and runs, with no intention of stopping. Unaware, the heroine escapes and hides behind some bushes. The girl is sitting, clutching her head and not understanding what to do now. At that moment, the Duke approaches and, calling her Roselia de Jessen by name, says that she is quite good at escaping. And although Klaus tries to remember how many times, counting this one, she has tried to flee from him, the heroine claims he is mistaken about the person. However, the Duke verified it several times, and it turned out that Roselia de Jessen's death was indeed staged. Blaming the officials who do their job poorly, he approaches the girl, who covers her face with her hands out of fear. Bending down in front of her, the Duke declares that he can now be sure that Antonio lied to him. To the question of whether the girl kept in contact with her brother all this time, Roselia asks that Antonio not be judged severely, as he did it for her. Since both deceived him, Klaus proposes to the girl to settle the Baron's debt in the duchy. Just like her brother, the heroine is horrified at the thought that she will now have to play two roles at once. Klaus considers it unfair that Antonio has to pay the entire family debt alone. Since there is no point in going back, the heroine musters courage and declares that, although she regrets the deception, she cannot help it because she is already helping her brother. And if the Duke thinks she will flee, next time she herself will bring him the money. Looking at the girl, Klaus cannot help but think that they are too similar not to be blood relatives. He watches her even more closely, but Closet's voice, who is also running out to the courtyard, distracts him. The heroine runs towards Roselia, and she, in tears, throws herself into Lady de Baltasar's arms. Now Klaus understands how the young woman managed to enter the banquet. He turns to his sister and asks if she was aware of everything. Closet refuses to listen to her brother's accusations about hiding this from her, as the Jessens were only trying to pay their debt. And there is nothing wrong with that. Seeing that the young Marquis has also gone out to the courtyard in search of the mysterious stranger, the Duke decides it's time to leave. Back at the mansion, he tells Roselia not to forget about next time. Closet regrets how things turned out, but the heroine calms her, saying that everything is fine because they were not caught. Lady Baltasar is amazed at how the Duke, so ingenious in everything else, can be so idiotic in this case. Not feeling like staying there anymore, Closet suggests to Roselia that they return to the banquet, and she agrees. On the way, she asks how she knows the crown prince and tells her to speak more quietly, because Klaus is one of those who move silently. The next day, the heroine is in a tavern as Antonio, wondering who forced her to speak. Now she needs to find the next painting as soon as possible to bring the money to the Duke. A waitress approaches the table and offers the menu to Antonio. The heroine notices paint stains on the woman's hands and understands that she is facing the one she is looking for. The second painting in the princess's collection was a work by the future and famous artist Nadia Erlos. Antonio smiles and asks for a pitcher of beer, but refuses the food. Then he asks the woman's name, justifying his curiosity with the desire to advise such a kind lady. But although the artist doesn't introduce herself, the owner, peering from behind the counter at that moment, calls her Nadia. Antonio smiles, confirming that he is facing the person he was looking for. But the boy fails to say a word when the woman's face changes drastically. As if frightened, in the blink of an eye, she turns around and flees, leaving both the visitor and the owner perplexed. The protagonist returns to the duchy, completely disheartened by the useless excursion. That yielded no results. Absorbed in her thoughts, she doesn't notice the Duke approaching stealthily from behind. When Klaus addresses Antonio, the latter flinches from surprise. The Duke sees nothing strange in de Jessen's fright, who, in his opinion, is clearly guilty. Antonio, on the contrary, doesn't understand why he should feel guilty, since he works hard to pay off his debt. Klaus asks if the boy wants to explain why his sister, supposedly dead, is alive and well, and furthermore, was at the banquet yesterday. He is furious about how Antonio dared to lie to him so blatantly. The look Klaus gives the boy at that moment seems capable of incinerating anyone. But Antonio regains composure and replies that he couldn't help it, as he didn't know what his lordship was really like. Now he knows how generous and just the Duke is, and therefore, if necessary, he is willing to accept the punishment, even if he had his reasons. Klaus interrupts Antonio's endless torrent of words, but inexplicably falls silent instantly. Dejessen doesn't understand what he means with such an indecisive tone. And suddenly, the Duke thanks the boy for the words he had said to him earlier. Antonio is stunned by the unexpected behavior of an always stern man. And cold. At the reception, Closet called Klaus little brother, and he suddenly realized that he had already forgotten when the last time she called him that was. The Duke admits that all this happened thanks to Antonio. Klaus thanks him for helping him prepare Closet's debut, and for making him see how important she is to him. The protagonist, dressed as a blonde again, walks through the market square, thinking about how the Duke can be. In the end, after thanking Antonio, he promised that this time he would act as if he had done nothing wrong. Roselia didn't expect this from him at all, and her heart squeezed in a strange way at the thought. Suddenly, the protagonist sees Nadia on the way, who is trying to justify herself to the tavern owner, asserting that yesterday she felt trapped. The woman begs for forgiveness just this once, as she really needs this job. But the owner doesn't want to rehire an employee who fled without notice in the middle of her work shift. He roughly throws Nadia out and slams the door in her face. No matter how much the woman knocks, the owner doesn't open up anymore. Only now does Nadia realize that a girl has been watching the whole scene. The woman abruptly asks the stranger what she's staring at so much, and if she's enjoying the show. Roselia fails to answer when no one turns around and leaves. Sensing that the stranger is following her, the woman stops dead. She advises her not to meddle where it doesn't concern her and to go her way, because what happened is none of her business. Roselia runs after her, asserting that she cannot ignore something like that and wanted to know if she is okay. Suddenly, Nadia stops so abruptly that the heroine bumps into her back. Upon lifting her head, she screams in fright as she sees two bandits in the middle of the road. They mock Nadia, who mistakenly believed she could be safe in this place. The man heads towards the girls, and a knife gleams in his hand. Roselia tries to coax from Nadia what those guys want from her, but she doesn't utter a word. Just then, another bandit approaches from behind, noticing with a malicious smile that she is not alone. Nadia pushes the man away from Roselia, saying they are not together, and begs him to leave her alone. Although the bandit doesn't buy that nonsense, the woman insists that she and the girl just met. But it seems even better to the villain, because that way Nadia won't worry if they take her away. The woman, with an unfriendly face, starts lecturing Roselia on the consequences of following strangers. The protagonist tells herself to calm down, that it doesn't matter if this happened in the original story or not. First, they must survive. She often watched self-defense tutorials on her mobile phone. They said that the first thing to do is to scream loudly to catch the opponent off guard. And that is exactly what Roselia does, leaving everyone around her completely stunned. At that moment, the Duke, who arrived in the city with Alejandro on business, hears a strange scream. But the assistant heard nothing, and since they have an appointment with the head of the merchants, he tells Klaus to hurry up. The Duke follows Alejandro, but something stops him again. Meanwhile, Roselia continues to scream with all her might. One of the bandits runs towards the girl with the intention of silencing that madwoman. The heroine remembers all the self-defense rules. She takes a step back, shifts weight to one leg, extends her arms, and when the man approaches, she pushes him with all her might. After that, taking Nadia's hand, Roselia runs out of the alley at full speed. However, they fail to escape, as the man with the scar on his face manages to grab Nadia. Just then, the Duke appears in the alley, and with a kick, throws the bandit far from the girls. After dealing with the criminal, Klaus admits that Roselia always manages to surprise him, appearing in such unexpected situations. While he tries to understand what mess the girl got herself into this time, another bandit runs towards him from behind. But the Duke reacts just in time and blocks the attack. The protagonist, meanwhile, grabs Nadia's hand and orders her to follow her. They hide behind some boxes, but the woman doesn't understand why they are doing this, since that man seemed like an acquaintance of the girl. In reality, not even Roselia understands why she fled, and she did it more by instinct. After meeting the protagonist, Nadia suddenly starts coughing a lot, but convinces the girl that she is fine. Then she gets up and asks Roselia to follow her, since, apparently, she was destined to be indebted to her new acquaintance. After walking several streets, Nadia opens the door of one of the houses and invites the girl inside. According to her, although the house is dilapidated, it is where she lives. And since Roselia helped her, Nadia wants to return the favor. The protagonist refuses, but the woman sits her down on a chair, asserting that she has self-respect. Nadia hides in another room, while Roselia examines her dwelling. Too humble. Suddenly, the woman returns, holding a painting she created herself. According to Nadia, she has little, and this is the only way she can repay the girl for her help. To her astonishment, the protagonist discovers that the artist has the second painting of the princess's collection. With a deep sigh, Nadia reveals that this is her last work. Roselia is perplexed. Does this woman know her destiny? In the original story, this talented artist died tragically due to her serious illness, without gaining recognition, and this abstract painting indeed became her final work. Nadia coughs again and confesses that she no longer has money to buy paintings. When asked if the woman had seen a doctor, she replies that she cannot afford it, since she is in debt and being pursued by loan sharks. Nadia begs not to be looked at with such pity, as she never thought she would live this long. Roselia asks why the artist doesn't sell her paintings, and she replies that she didn't paint them to sell. It was her only escape, because people in that situation, when they get sick, can only await death with resignation. But when Nadia immersed herself in drawing, she could forget everything and evade the harsh reality. The artist sold everything she owned, but she was unwilling to sell her inner freedom. Realizing that she is telling her story to a stranger, Nadia asks her to just take the painting, although she doesn't understand what use that girl could have for it. Roselia thanks the artist for such a wonderful gift, and she, in response, only advises her not to appear in this neighborhood again, unless she wants to witness something terrible. However, Roselia, after taking the painting, against Nadia's expectations, promises her that she will return soon without fail. She supposes that if this artist gains recognition for her work now, perhaps she will survive. And the next day, the protagonist, dressed as Antonio again, heads to the crown princess's palace. Upon meeting, Ibelian confesses that she was disappointed not to see Dejessen at Closet's party. However, she says, she was lucky enough to meet her younger sister, Lady Roselia. Ibelian believes that Antonio must have received rumors that the crown prince became interested in his sister at the ball. Upon hearing this, the heroine begins to tremble, as it is hardly possible to call Esteban taking advantage of her interest. Antonio fails to reply when the crown princess asks him to arrange a meeting with Roselia. She asks him not to worry, as she doesn't intend to interrogate her sister. As the future empress of Luke Belsit, caring for and protecting the people of this country is her duty. Nevertheless, according to her, the crown prince, unfortunately, still does not understand the seriousness of his position, so he will continue to behave as he did at that banquet. The heroine is fascinated by the crown princess's incredible understanding, and Belian continues to insist that, with factions threatening power, Esteban will give them more reason to oppose the imperial family. She cannot stand idly by watching the ruling house collapse, and that is why she wants Lady Roselia to become the crown prince's wife. Antonio cannot hide his amazement and the shock caused by what he just heard. He tries to convince Ibelian that Roselia will refuse, as she lacks education, and can hardly be considered noble. Nevertheless, the princess insists that the young woman will receive the appropriate education in the palace. And furthermore, in history, there have been emperors who married peasant women. The protagonist feels that even out of a strong desire to protect power, this is too much. She always admired her great sense of responsibility and her firm determination towards her duty. But sometimes, she couldn't help but feel compassion for her. Therefore, Antonio asks permission to ask the crown princess a question. He wants to know if what was said before is her personal opinion, or if she considers it correct only from her position. For Ibelian, this question is strange. Is she the princess? She cannot conceive of a version of herself that is not the crown princess. It doesn't matter if they refer to her as Ibelian or as crown princess. After a pause, Antonio replies that some call him ducal servant and others fallen noble. But no matter what title they give him, it's just a mask. He doesn't believe that is his true essence. In reality, the heroine reminds herself of this over and over again, whether as Antonio or Roselia. Tejasin concludes that no matter how they see him, he will never forget who he really is. Placing the painting on the easel, he apologizes for insisting and asks Ibelian how she feels without her princess role. The young woman reflects on her true feelings. Looking at the painting, she confesses that she is disappointed in Esteban and feels a little lonely in the imperial palace. That's why the painting became Ibelian's only comfort. She never expected much from Esteban. She just wanted him to respect her as a partner in building the empire. And now Ibelian feels that the author of this painting felt the same way she did. She is incredibly beautiful, but hides a silent loneliness. It's just that, yes, these two very different people resemble each other so much. Both gave up and lost everything, even themselves. Antonio is happy that the painting, which depicts a vast, bright sky, and beautiful, was liked by Her Highness. The work is titled Freedom, longed for by Nadia, the heroine, and perhaps even by Ibelian. The crown princess smiles and thanks Antonio. The next day, someone knocks on the door of Nadia's house. Upon seeing that it is Roselia, the artist opens up and reminds her of her warning not to return. But upon lifting her head, Nadia freezes, stunned. Roselia is at the door, smiling widely, surrounded by people. Upon entering, the girl gives instructions to the men about the repair. Then, another man approaches Nadia and asks about her health, and when the first symptoms appeared, the woman demands an explanation for what is happening. Roselia says she is there on the direct order of Her Highness, deeply moved by Nadia's work. The crown princess decided to sponsor the artist so that she can continue creating. With these words, Roselia gives Nadia a gift of her own, a chest full of paints. She reminds her of her own words, that the painting was the last thing she wanted to protect. And now she won't have to lose it again. Nadia, with trembling hands, accepts the gift, hugs it, thanks Roselia, and tears stream down her face. Later, having tea, the artist asks the girl to visit her more often, because she feels a little lonely. Roselia promises to visit Nadia often, and in return, she begs her to take her medicine regularly. At noon, the protagonist arrives at the Baltasar Duchy in Roselia's appearance. Not understanding why she promised to bring the money, next time instead of Antonio, she knocks on the door of Klaus's office. Entering, Roselia greets the Duke, visibly embarrassed. Klaus finds it strange that she is wearing the same outfit, but she explains that she must save every penny to settle her debt. With his arms crossed in an arrogant pose, the Duke points out that he fled again that day. As usual, Roselia insists that she is very grateful, only that her companion felt unwell, and they had to escape. Klaus leans over her and, with a severe face, demands that she explain what she is plotting. Appearing at the ball and then being chased by bandits, he doesn't understand why Roselia is so stubborn and refuses to join the duchy. But no matter how much he asks, the heroine will not change her answer. So, once again, she repeats that she feels much more comfortable this way. The Duke wants to know how long Roselia intends to suffer, but she doesn't understand why he cares so much. She asserts that she can take care of herself perfectly well. Hearing this, Klaus slams his hand on the table and declares that she and her brother have an amazing ability to get on his nerves. He wants Roselia to stop being stubborn once and for all. And again, leaning over her, he smells that aroma, sweet and intoxicating. Klaus doesn't understand if there are even perfumes with that scent. The heroine points to the envelope with the promised part of the debt and thanks him once again for his previous help. However, according to her, he has no right to decide about her life. Roselia begs the Duke not to misunderstand her. She owes him money, not her body. The scent emanating from the girl drives Klaus crazy, and he asks if she will cling to her pride until the end. Anyone who heard him would think he craves her body, and she rejects him to give herself importance. The Duke asks how much she must pay for her to accept, but he doesn't finish speaking when he receives a slap. Anger and resentment mix on the protagonist's face. Tears well up in her eyes. She declares that from now on she will pay the rest of the debt through Antonio. Hoping never to meet again for such unpleasant matters, Roselia leaves the office. Remaining alone, Klaus de Baltasar suddenly realizes how foolish he has been. That slap brought him to his senses, and he is amazed at the stupidity he just let slip. The Duke doesn't understand why, when it comes to those two siblings, he loses all sanity. Closet bursts into Antonio's room and with a radiant smile suggests playing a game. Nevertheless, Dejessen doesn't even lift his head, and the girl immediately asks what's wrong. After seating the protagonist at the table, Closet offers her cookies she received as a gift and brought to share. However, for some reason, that idiot doesn't leave Roselia's mind, and the more she thinks about his words, the angrier she gets. Unable to control her emotions, the protagonist breaks the cookie in her hands, and it crumbles into small pieces. Seeing this, Closet gets angry and scolds Roselia for taking out her frustration on an innocent cookie. Since she doesn't like her friend's mood, she suggests going for a picnic by the lake. And although Roselia is not in the mood for it, Closet believes that precisely for this reason, a little fresh air will do her good. Meanwhile, the Duke is working, but he is so distracted that Alejandro has to repeat everything several times. The assistant asks what is worrying his lordship so much, and then he confesses that a woman won't leave him alone. The idea that the Duke finally found someone he likes makes Alejandro so happy that he wants to know her name to arrange a meeting immediately. And when Klaus replies that it's not like that, the assistant doesn't understand why he thinks about her then. The only reason why, in his opinion, the Duke might think about a woman is if she fled, stealing his money. Deciding that his lordship could use a rest, Alejandro promises to take care of the rest and suggests going out for some fresh air. Walking, Klaus thinks about how ridiculous the idea that he likes that woman sounds. He is sure that it is all due to that peculiarly charming scent. Turning around, the Duke sees Closet and Antonio passing by in a boat. Meanwhile, Closet keeps asking Antonio if he is really not worried about anything, since it's not important enough to consult Lady Balthasar about. Dejessen replies affirmatively. A strong gust of wind tears the hat off Closet's head. Although she says she will buy another one, Antonio leans over to retrieve it from the water. Closet tries to stop him, but he, absorbed in the Duke, doesn't hear her. Lady Balthasar doesn't react, and in an instant, Antonio falls into the water. Thoughts collide in his mind. He doesn't know how to swim. Terror floods her. Roselia refuses to believe that after all this, it will end like this, and longs to be saved. A splash and Klaus, like a saving beacon in the darkness, extends his hand to Antonio. After pulling Dejessen out of the water, the Duke shouts at him to hold on tight. Coughing and opening his eyes, Klaus doesn't understand how he could have thought about jumping into the lake. Tears well up in the heroine's eyes as she grasps the true feeling of death. And while the Duke asks Antonio if he can live 1 second without causing trouble, he thinks he lives with death hanging over him. And everything that is happening is no longer lines from a book, but reality. Tearfully, Antonio confesses to the Duke that he truly thought he would die. She wonders if it's necessary to scold someone who barely survived so harshly. At that very moment, Closet, who had docked on the shore, runs towards them. She rushes to make sure Antonio is okay and can breathe. Closet is very scared and orders him never to do foolish things like jumping into the water for a hat again. Dejessen promises and tells her he is very sorry. Upon raising his head, he notices the Duke's strange look upon him. Klaus is already leaving, and Antonio thanks him for saving him. But he, without even turning around, advises the boy to simply take care of himself. Closet cannot comprehend how he can be so cruel and cold when someone almost died in front of him. When the Duke returns to the mansion, Alejandro is surprised why he looks like he's been through a deluge. However, Klaus says nothing and simply passes by, lost in his own thoughts. Antonio, who almost died, is stuck in his mind, and the Duke tries to understand what that strange feeling he has inside is. Dejessen visits the crown princess and tells her that although Nadia rejected the payment for the painting, she accepted the sponsorship. Upon learning that Abelio Hauntum is also actively working on his pieces, Ibelian congratulates Contonio for the excellent job done. According to Dejessen, he only did what he had to do. Ibelian wants to ask Antonio something and tells him that a delegation from the Empire of Raflios will arrive soon. From this news, the protagonist understands that the time has come for the second protagonist of the novel to appear. According to the Crown Princess, as soon as the ambassadors arrive, there will be a welcome banquet in their honor. Ibelian wants Antonio to visit as a guest of honor alongside Roselia. The protagonist doesn't understand why everyone is so eager to see her two identities at once. Antonio tries to decline the invitation, arguing that the visit of a mere servant could cause misunderstandings. Ibelian concedes that his argument makes sense, given the circumstances. However, she proposes that in that case, only Roselia attend the banquet. As Antonio tries to dissuade the princess again, she fears she is asking too much, and she explains that she just wanted to show kindness towards the Dejessens. Ibelion declares that, apparently, she is destined to remain alone, admiring paintings, and drowning in suffering. And although Antonio realizes that he is deliberately exaggerating, he promises to discuss it with Roselia. Upon leaving the room, the heroine thinks that things get more complicated every day. Now she also has to prepare for the imperial banquet. She barely gets used to the idea when the crown prince himself appears, and although she greets him properly, Esteban thinks she is too cold for someone who knows her secret. Roselia thinks that he, in turn, should be a little warmer towards the crown princess. She is about to say goodbye and leave, when suddenly Esteban speaks again. He asks if Roselia knows anything about the Raelios, whose bodies emanate a natural scent. Not understanding what nonsense he is talking about, the protagonist asks why he is asking her that. Esteban replies that Roselia, obviously, doesn't know much about herself. He heard that she actually has no blood ties with Baron Jessen. To the question of whether she knows anything about her parents, Roselia replies that her mother died soon, and she didn't tell her anything. According to Esteban, this is her opportunity to find out, as there is a relative in the delegation. But the crown prince doesn't manage to say who, because a guard runs to him to announce the arrival of the ambassadors. Esteban promises to come as soon as the conversation is over, but when he turns around, Roselia is no longer by his side. The crown prince looks regretfully at the fleeing girl, because he was going to give her some advice. If Roselia doesn't learn to control this on her own, she will have many problems in the future. It was always a great honor for Alejandro to serve as the Duke's closest secretary. The Lord of Baltasar always dedicates himself completely to his work, but lately, his assistant has noticed him behaving strangely. The Duke suddenly sighs deeply, or suddenly starts talking to himself, which he had never done before. Since he seems constantly stressed, Alejandro decided not to bother him at those times. And today, on one of those days, the Duke orders his assistant to call Antonio. Alejandro goes to carry out the order, thinking how unfortunate poor Antonio must be. Dejessen cautiously enters the Duke's office, fearing another dispute. But surprisingly, Klaus asks about Roselia and if she has a fiancé. Antonio doesn't understand why he is asking him that question. Then the Duke explains that he is interested in his sister. The boy is so shocked that he is speechless for a moment. But Klaus sees nothing strange, as attraction is natural. Since Antonio cannot find the words, the Duke repeats his question. Instead of answering, Dejessen says that this is unacceptable. The protagonist knows how this ends. They cannot be together. And to prevent it, Antonio claims that Roselia already has a lover. The Duke is baffled. How can her lover watch her suffer, drowning in debt, wandering homeless, and fleeing from thugs? Antonio replies that it is because they live very far from each other. What an excuse. Klaus thoughtfully lets slip that if there are no guards at the door, he will enter without ceremony. But Antonio sees it as a total invasion of property. He says that Roselia doesn't want to see anyone as long as she has a boyfriend. Antonio's behavior seems very strange to the Duke. He doesn't understand why he reacts like this to someone like him, with his status and wealth. Klaus, scrutinizing, asks if there might be some other hidden reason. But surprise, he suddenly changes. He says he understands Antonio's love for his sister and orders him to leave. Not understanding the fuss of this cold tyrant, Dejessen leaves the office, completely unsettled. Alone, the Duke reflects on what he really expected and demands that he compose himself once and for all. He convinces himself that it is not Antonio, but that he feels a strong attraction towards Roselia. Meanwhile, the crown prince and princess receive the Raffaello's delegation in Luke Belseat. Marquis Johannes von Useliet steps forward and, taking Jubelion's hand, introduces himself with a smile. The Marquis thinks His Highness wants to tell him something and asks him directly. The princess wants to know, although it sounds inopportune at the first meeting, if Useliet has a younger brother. Upon hearing this, Esteban realizes that Ibelion felt the same as him. However, the Marquis replies that he does not have a younger brother, and the crown princess apologizes. Esteban also notices the great resemblance of that man to Antonio, or rather, to Roselia. And then, Useliet reveals that he actually had a younger sister, but she disappeared more than 10 years ago, and it is still unknown whether she is alive or not. The crown princess regrets having asked, but the marquis replies that it's okay. It's a thing of the past. Esteban offers to accompany Euquilio to his quarters. Following the crown prince and princess, the marquis thinks about his sister, whom he hasn't remembered for so long. The last time he saw Cecilia and her mother, the girl was 3 years old. He wonders what has become of Cecilia, because if she is alive, she should be an adult by now. Approaching the banquet hall, decorated for the Rayfleo's delegation, Closet feels incredible excitement. Unlike Roselia, apparently, every noble in the empire is present at today's banquet, and Roselia feels that she should not attend the event, since she can hardly be considered a noble. However, Closet gives her confidence, reminding her that she is a guest of honor, personally invited by the crown princess. Taking her friend by the hand, she drags her into the hall, eager to see what people have gathered today. Lady Closet seems to be quite popular at the banquet and is quickly invited to the first dance. The heroine looks around, searching for the Rayfleo's delegation. She is dying to see the second protagonist. Not far away, she spots an incredibly handsome man, surrounded by ladies. While trying to remember how this character was described in the novel, and if he is the one, the crown prince approaches Roselia. The heroine curtsies, but Esteban indicates with a gesture to straighten up. He thinks the girl is a bit cruel, since the last time he tried to help her, and she fled at full speed. Roselia tries to justify her flight by saying that the crown prince seemed busy, and she didn't want to bother him, much less offend him. Esteban is willing to forgive her if she promises him another dance in return. Meanwhile, the Duke calls Alejandro and orders him to handle the rest of the documents himself, and he himself heads to the banquet, hoping to make a good impression for future negotiations with the delegation. He plans to focus on work, staying away from Antonio and Roselia, hoping to forget everything at the event. But his plans fall apart, because upon entering the hall, there is Roselia, chatting with the crown prince. He doesn't understand what she is doing there, but he feels relief to find her, and not Antonio. Although seeing her near the crown prince again ignites Klaus's fury, Esteban invites Roselia to dance, saying he must tell her something important, but she prefers to talk without dancing. At that very moment, Klaus approaches them. He also expected to be her first dance partner of the evening. The guests murmur, wondering who this lady coveted by the crown prince is. And the Duke of Baltasar. Esteban reminds Klaus of the hierarchy, but the latter replies that His Highness should respect Roselia's choice. While they argue heatedly, the protagonist thinks, why are they forcing her to go through this, if she hates them both? And so, both men extend their hands towards the girl, leaving the choice to her. Even so, in her opinion, a heartless man is better than a married one. That's why she will dance with the Duke. Klaus feels honored by her choice, although Roselia asks him not to misunderstand him, since she didn't choose him out of affection. She is sure that he doesn't like her either, and that he had his own reasons for inviting her to dance. According to the girl, Klaus did it for the crown princess, because if His Highness dances with Roselia again, Ibilian will have problems. Klaus confesses that it's not entirely true, as he didn't want to lose Roselia to the crown prince. The girl's face lights up upon realizing that he was serious when he expressed interest in her. According to Klaus, he doesn't understand Roselia at all, who completely attracts the crown prince's attention. He advises her to turn around and sees Esteban staring intensely at her, as if burning her with his gaze. The Duke is sure that, right after the dance, the crown prince will be ready to snatch Roselia away. The girl is in shock, she doesn't know what to do. Klaus, without thinking, takes her hand and leads her out of the hall. He leads her to the balcony and tells her to stay there until the atmosphere calms down. How chivalrous! She wonders, with some suspicion, how well she knows the crown prince himself. Klaus doesn't quite understand what's going on, but Roselia must know that the prince's interest bodes no good. But she never sought his attention. She is as confused as he is. What a tense situation. While Roselia justifies herself, saying she didn't choose any of this, the Duke sees Esteban passing by. He covers her mouth with his hand. He gestures for her to be quiet, and they hide together behind the door. The crown prince passes by, not noticing that someone is on the balcony. They were almost discovered. When Klaus turns back to Roselia, still holding her by the shoulders, he freezes, unable to look away. Overwhelmed by the closeness, the protagonist asks the Duke to step back a little. What a moment! But Klaus caresses the girl's face and speaks of an incredibly pleasant aroma emanating from her. Then he leans down and kisses Roselia on the lips. The protagonist realizes that she likes the warmth of his lips. However, recovering instantly, she pushes the man away from her. Covering her face with one hand, overwhelmed by emotions, Roselia flees. The protagonist runs down the hall, trying to understand if she has gone crazy, since the feeling of being bewitched doesn't leave her. Just then, Esteban blocks her path and, taking her by the shoulders, reminds her that he had something important to tell her. And although Roselia doesn't want to talk now, he declares that the whole palace is full of her scent. The crown prince wanted to warn her before, but she always runs away and she gets a headache because of it. But sooner or later, someone will notice and she must be careful. The protagonist tries to discreetly sniff herself, not understanding what scent he is talking about. Esteban advises Roselia to stay away from the Duke, because, although he is a little annoyed by it, he likes the girl, and deep down, he would rather have nothing to do with her. Roselia wonders if she is approaching her destiny, like Klaus, sowing discord between the protagonists. To fall at his feet after solving his problems, she must not get involved with the Duke under any circumstances. She needs to control herself urgently. The young woman does not realize that, all this time, a gray-haired man with an eye patch has been watching her. When the protagonist returns to the banquet hall, Closet lunges at her instantly. The girl demands that she explain what important thing she was doing, and why she left her completely alone. And although the kiss with Klaus comes to mind, she is quick to assure Closet that she didn't move from there. Lady Balthazar thinks her friend's words sound a bit suspicious. Looking at her, the protagonist tries to imagine Closet's reaction if she found out about the kiss with her brother. Recalling Esteban's words, Roselia asks the girl if she smells anything, but she doesn't notice anything. The protagonist longs to flee this banquet and asks Closet for permission, citing extreme exhaustion. Lady Balthazar looks closely at Roselia and assumes she has a fever, as she is very red. She agrees that the young woman should return and prepares to call a carriage. While waiting for the carriage, the protagonist thinks about escaping as soon as possible, before running into Klaus, since she doesn't know how to look him in the face now. At that very moment, the Duke comes out of the palace, looking around. Thinking that he is looking for her, Roselia tries to hide somewhere, and nearby Marquis Euclid is waiting for his carriage. Since the protagonist is focused on watching Klaus so as not to be seen, she doesn't look around, and accidentally bumps into Johans. Their bright green eyes meet, and in that very second the Duke spots them. Not wanting to interact with Klaus, the protagonist, apologizing in advance for such a meeting, asks the Marquis to take her. Johan smiles and offers the girl a ride in his carriage. Observing everything from a distance, the Duke tries to understand why they are leaving together. He recalls Antonio's words and wonders if the Marquis is Roselia's lover. Once safe, the protagonist thanks the man for agreeing to her sudden request. Euclid is sure that the girl had her reasons, so he couldn't refuse. Roselia values him and asks him to drop her off somewhere nearby. But Johans refuses and will escort her home, as it is dangerous for a lady to walk alone so late. Knowing that she won't be able to return to the duchy in this situation, the heroine decides to stay with Nadia today. Suddenly, the Marquis asks the girl if she doesn't think they look alike a bit. Only after these words, Roselia realizes that indeed it is so. With a slight blush, she replies that there are many similar people in the world. When Johans finally introduces himself, Roselia realizes she is facing the second male protagonist of the novel. He says he came as part of the Rayfleau's delegation, and the girl admits to having heard of him. Looking out the window, the protagonist says she lives nearby and asks to be let out. Wanting to walk a little, upon getting out of the carriage, she thanks the Marquis once again for his help. To say goodbye, Johans adds that he will eagerly await their next meeting. After saying goodbye to Roselia with his gaze, he orders his assistant to find out everything about that young woman. Although she has a different hair color, she strongly resembles the one he lost so long ago. Returning from the banquet, a tired Closet prepares to sleep, while Klaus asks his sister about Antonio. The girl doesn't understand why he is asking such questions, since Antonio should be in his room by now. Klaus is surprised by his sister's reaction, but he insists that she leave the boy alone, because he wasn't feeling well today. Duke Closet didn't listen, and in a couple of minutes he was already knocking on Antonio's bedroom door. Since no one answers from the bedroom, he opens the door and enters. However, the Duke finds no one in the room, and the boy's nighttime escape arouses his curiosity. In the morning, Nadia asks Roselia to explain why she came to her house in the middle of the night and asked for lodging. She assumes she was kicked out of the house or that a boy is involved. The heroine reacts so sharply to her assumption that Nadia becomes even more convinced she is right. Returning to the canvas on the easel, the woman starts coughing, and Roselia asks her if she is taking medicine. Nadia reassures her, stating that she takes them regularly, but the doctor said she will need a little more time to fully recover. Smiling, she starts teasing Roselia again and advises her to think about her lover instead of her. After having breakfast with Nadia, the protagonist, dressed as Antonio, finally returns to the duchy. But oh surprise, Klaus was impatiently waiting for her in his room. Antonio is stunned by the Duke's presence in his bedroom, while the latter demands to know where Dejessen has been. The heroine is greatly infuriated by Klaus's attitude. Turning around, Antonio replies tiredly that it is a personal matter. From that response, the Duke deduces that the boy has a secret lover. Antonio wants to change clothes, and therefore asks Klaus to leave his room. But the Duke is unmoved, because he again perceives that unmistakable scent. He reminds Antonio that he is his employer, and that he is obliged to manage and protect his employees. Therefore, he wants to know what personal matter kept Dejessen absent all night. The boy believes that, whether employer or not, the Duke has no right to interfere in his private life. Klaus retorts that, according to imperial law, the Duke has the right to interrogate a commoner. Having slept poorly in a strange bed, and being very tired, Antonio decides to end this, and says that he went out with a friend. Klaus keeps insisting and tries to find out the name of that friend. When he replies that they don't know each other, the Duke asks if it is a man or a woman. Klaus himself doesn't understand what's wrong with him or why he's asking that. He forces himself to compose himself mentally, since it shouldn't matter to him whether Antonio has a lover or not. His thoughts are interrupted by Dejessen, who suddenly claims that this friend was actually a woman. And now, as he must prepare for work, he asks the Duke to leave his room. But Klaus doesn't leave and declares that any personal matter can affect work. Antonio reminds him that it is 7 in the morning. It's not even working hours. The Duke, inexplicably, explodes and orders him to be careful, as the tone irritates him. Dejessen's actions, clothes, and scent. After letting all this out, he hastily leaves the room. The protagonist fails to understand this man's problem that makes him behave this way since the morning. She thought the Duke had left, but upon turning around she realizes with horror that he has suddenly decided to return. Leaning over Antonio, Klaus demands that he arrange a meeting with Roselia as soon as possible. To the question of whether he can't just convey it through him, the Duke replies sarcastically that it is personal. Furthermore, he wants to know where Antonio's sister currently resides. With his head down, the servant replies that Roselia will not be able to meet him. The protagonist cannot continue like this and will not allow herself to follow this deadly path. So she says that Roselia is right now with someone very important. The Duke has an idea of who that important person might be, but he cannot find out because Antonio flees, shouting that it is a family matter. The Duke can only wonder if Roselia is closer to Marquis Euclid than he thought. All this misunderstanding surrounding this matter only deepens with time. Later, watering the garden flowers, the heroine wonders why the Duke cannot give up when they reject him so fiercely. Erlin, who is by her side, points out that she has overwatered and caused a flood. Abelo approaches Dejessen, who opines that Antonio should not have gone so far, since his mission should have ended with the delivery of the donation, nothing more. It doesn't escape the artist that the boy is worried about something, and although Antonio assures him that he is fine, little Erlin also agrees with her father. Then Dejessen confesses that, although it is not that important, there is someone who worries him. He has no interest in getting close to him, but they have to keep meeting for work, and that creates some discomfort. The thought of this brings back the memory of the kiss with the Duke to the protagonist's mind. She clutches her head, trying to discard that thought, and believing she is going crazy. Suddenly, Abelo notices that Antonio, evidently, does not hate that person. And when the boy tries to say the opposite, the artist doubts his sincerity. According to Abelo, it doesn't matter if Antonio likes that person or not. The important thing is to face the problem. Fleeing won't solve anything. As soon as he decides which side he is on, the anxiety will disappear immediately. Above all, Antonio is a man, and it is not fitting for him to run away from problems. Dejessen thanks Abelo for the advice, asserting that he really feels better, planning to give the Duke a firm rejection and end this once and for all. The heroine says goodbye to the Hunt family. Walking down the street, she witnesses an old man being rudely thrown out of a tavern. The man is irritated because they mistake him for a beggar and assures them that he has money. But when he puts his hand in his pocket, he finds it completely empty. The shopkeeper leaves, muttering annoyedly, and Antonio runs to the old man to help him up. But he, irritated, begins to accuse the boy of having stolen his money. Antonio tries to help the old man and accompany him home, but he shouts that he doesn't need help and that he will find his way alone. Realizing that he can do nothing, the boy leaves the stranger and continues on his way. But after a few steps, Antonio turns back again and sees that the old man is still standing in the same spot. He runs to the man, takes him by the arm, and asks if he remembers his address. It is now obvious that the old man has dementia, and it is not surprising that he has problems because of it. The man insists that he can go alone, but Antonio insists that he tell him the address. Finally, the old man says a street, although the certainty in his voice is quite doubtful. Antonio takes him by the hand and guides him, scolding himself for his stupid habit of meddling. Upon reaching the correct house, they find themselves in front of a large door, and the protagonist doubts that this is the correct address. However, the old man opens the door and enters the mansion, despite Antonio's attempts to stop him. The surname Bernas is written on the door. Turning to the boy, the old man asks if he is waiting for a special invitation, and offers him to follow him. To the question of whether he is the owner of this mansion, the man replies with another question. Does he look like someone who wanders around other people's houses? The protagonist cannot believe this amazing coincidence. She has been lucky enough to meet the artist, Count Waldro de Bernas. The mansion, covered in cobwebs, looks quite abandoned. According to Waldro, everyone ran away from him because he forgot to pay them. In fact, in the original story, this man also showed signs of dementia. However, when Waldro's mind cleared, he created true masterpieces, and a single painting could settle all his debts. Looking around, Antonio doesn't see a single painting in the house. He asks if Mr. Bernas is not engaged in artistic creation. The man looks at the boy with surprise, wondering if he looks like someone who can still do something like that. And while Antonio tries to figure out how to answer that question, Waldro suddenly asks him what he is doing in his house. The Marquis's secretary, Juliet Lochnan, brings him a report on the investigation conducted. According to the information obtained, after the death of Baron Hessen, his children, Antonio and Roselia, are paying off their debts together. But they are not blood siblings, since the Baron remarried and officially registered Roselia. And her mother, Johannes, is eager to know when this happened, and his heart stops when he hears that these are events from 19 years ago. The Marquis clutches his head. It has been exactly 20 years since his mother and Cecilia disappeared without a trace. He was with them in the carriage when hooded figures cut them off. When the carriage overturned, Johannes was trapped underneath it. He could only watch through a crack as his mother and sister were taken away. The date this all happened coincides with the date the Baron got married. Believing that his mother might still be alive, the Marquis asks Lognan about Roselia's mother. But it turns out that the woman died 18 years ago. Johannes dismisses his assistant and thanks him for his hard work. Alone, he reflects on why his mother hasn't returned to the Marquisate. Possibly, someone was pursuing them, and she was trying to hide their identities with Cecilia. Perhaps all this is just desperate conjecture, fueled by his hopes. But Johannes must check if Roselia is Cecilia. Meanwhile, the protagonist, after thoroughly cleaning Waldro de Bernas's house, feels incredibly refreshed. After cleaning, she prepares him dinner so he can regain his strength, heal soon, and paint again. After eating, Waldro unexpectedly begins to feel a strange chill. Promising to return tomorrow, the protagonist takes a carriage to return to the duchy. Directly in the carriage, she takes off Antonio's clothes and transforms back into Roselia. The girl agrees with Mr. Abelo. Avoiding the problem will not solve anything. One must face it. Upon arriving at the estate, she thanks the coachman and asks him to leave the luggage in the hallway on the first floor of the main building. The man looks perplexedly at the passenger, who before getting into the carriage was a boy, and now suddenly is a girl. The Duke is sitting in his office, and the kiss with Roselia is stuck in his mind. They inform him of Lady de Hessen's visit, and Klaus, turning abruptly towards the table, plans to have a calm conversation this time. He convinces himself to remain calm and rational, and tells the girl to come in. Roselia appears in the doorway, illuminating the entire office with her beauty, feigning being busy working. The Duke, trying to control himself, asks the girl where she has been all this time. And although, according to Roselia, it is difficult for her to talk about it, he wants to know if she was with that man. No matter how much Klaus tries to restrain himself, the words seem to come out of his mouth on their own. He stares intently at the protagonist and asks if she was with her lover. Roselia believes it is not important and does not concern the Duke, but she came today to clarify something. According to the girl, she feels nothing for Klaus and asks him to stop bothering her. And Antonio, the Duke, smiles, gets up from the table, and approaches Roselia. Leaning over her, he asks what happened that day, if she feels nothing for him. She says she just got carried away by the moment, that she already has a lover, that the kiss meant nothing, and it was a mistake. The Duke decides to check if Roselia considers it a mistake now and kisses her again. He feels her relax and reciprocate his kiss. Looking her in the eyes, Klaus summarizes that if Roselia has a lover, she is still willing to do this with him. And he strongly doubts that she can call it a mistake again now. Thinking that these are the feelings of the original Roselia from the novel, the heroine admits that her body is indeed attracted to Klaus. But that's where it ends. And even if her body desires him, she will not give up her future for an empty relationship. Because in the end, they are nothing more than debtor and creditor, united by money and necessity. The day they accuse her of treason and take her to the guillotine, I doubt the Duke will save her. Klaus doesn't understand what treason she is talking about. Roselia replies that the Duke risks nothing, but mercilessly discards what is not convenient for him. The young woman is sure that she perfectly described the type of person he is. Klaus asks her to stop. He believes it is unfair to act this way because of something so unlikely. But for Roselia, it is enough that he did not deny that possibility. After asking him not to confuse her with empty words, the protagonist leaves the Duke's office. The girl leaves the mansion, convinced that this will be enough to avoid the fate of the original story. She will not die, and that is all that matters right now. And suddenly, despite the false calm, Roselia realizes that, for some reason, tears well up in her eyes. The girl blames the body of her heroine, which obviously does not intend to obey her. Just as she is about to pass through the gates, Marquis Euquilian approaches them from the other side. And although Johannes's assistant doubts they will be allowed to see the Marquis without an appointment, he doesn't care. He did not come to meet Baltasar, but to see his servant, Antonio. Roselia's whereabouts, strangely enough, turned out to be impossible to track. Therefore, her half-brother, who works in the Duke's mansion, is the only one who can provide any information. And at that very moment, the gates open and Johannes sees Roselia in front of him. Behind her, a furious Duke suddenly appears and grabs her arm. Roselia begs to be let go, but Klaus is furious because she left without even listening to him. But their argument is interrupted by the arrival of Marquis Euquilian, who demands an explanation for what is happening. Without explaining why he is there, Johannes pulls the Duke's hand off the girl. Then he moves Roselia away and asks Klaus severely if he doesn't see that the young woman is unwell. After making sure she is fine, the Marquis examines the protagonist's reddened wrist. Klaus remains silent to the side, not understanding what the hell has happened to him. Johannes, meanwhile, says that perhaps he should return another time, and suddenly, he perceives that unmistakable scent that, without a doubt, indicates that Roselia is his family. Members of the Rayflios clan possess a unique body odor, characteristic only of them, which, like pheromones, is imperceptible to people of the same sex, but it is strongly felt by the opposite sex, especially when feelings of joy, pain, or love intensify. Johannes, sure that she is Cecilia, proposes that they leave together somewhere else, if she allows it. He is happy to finally find, after so many years, his sister, who must have suffered a lot alone in that strange country. Already in the carriage, Johannes is impatient to tell her that he is her brother, but realizes that it is not the time. The protagonist looks up and notices the Marquis's deep and penetrating gaze, who once again saved her. Euquilian asks if the girl is having problems with the Duke, as everything looked very serious from the outside. Roselia replies that she and Mr. Baltasar are connected by work, due to which disagreements have arisen. From these words, Johannes deduces that she is truly suffering because of the payment of the Baron's debt. With the excuse of urgent matters, the protagonist asks to be let out, and at that moment she seems to see disappointment in the Marquis's eyes. Without taking his eyes off her, Johannes, almost calling her Cecilia, asks if they will be able to see each other again. Seeing Roselia's ambiguous reaction, he begs her not to misunderstand him. Johannes insists that it is not as she thinks, that she only strongly resembles his younger sister. Afterwards, he asks the girl to come to him if she ever needs help. Upon getting out of the carriage, Roselia reflects on how strange everything is. The second male protagonist should be irritating, but for some reason, it is the opposite. After that incident, the protagonist returned to her daily life. She worked day and night to help the Count regain his memory. However, it was not as easy as it seemed at first. But if Bernays could paint again, Roselia could pay off her debt and leave. And one day, during one of her visits to Mr. Waldro, the protagonist finds a portrait of his son. According to the old man, he now commands the Empire's best fleet on the front lines. He calls his son a scoundrel. He, no matter how busy he is with state affairs, could be interested if his father is alive. Or dead. The protagonist knows that the Count was also in the military in the past and asks him about those times. In his prime, Waldro sailed the seas of Callio, leading a fleet of several dozen ships. A couple of times, he even had to face the sea monster Kraken, while Waldro recounts the victory in the Battle of Clamon and how they were received by the royal family. The protagonist is glad to have revived the old man's memories. But suddenly, the Count's face darkens as he remembers how many comrades he lost then. He begins to shout that the fleet must retreat, abandon the wounded, and transfer only the living to the ships. And although it took quite some time, Antonio finally manages to calm Waldro. The old man behaved as if he had returned to the battlefield, as, obviously, the pain of memories still haunts him. No matter how much the protagonist needs that money, she doesn't want to go that far. Just as Antonio apologizes to Waldro, the doorbell rings. The guest rings the bell insistently, and Antonio runs at full speed to open it. Dijeson is greatly surprised to see Lady Closet at the door. Since her friend had been avoiding her lately, Lady Balthazar made an effort and found where she was hiding. Smiling, Closet asks where the Count is, to greet him first of all. But when the young woman approaches Mr. Bernays, he, with his arms crossed, declares that he will not buy anything from her. No matter how much Lady Balthazar tries to explain who she is, he doesn't want to hear anything. And the young woman begins to doubt whether he is really the artist Roselia was looking for. According to the heroine, it is undoubtedly Waldro, only now he is in such a state that he hasn't even seen his works. Knowing that Roselia needs this old man to get rid of her brother as soon as possible, Closet asks her to allow her to help. She takes paints, draws a house on the canvas that looks more like a childish scribble, and asks the Count to evaluate her painting. Seeing her scribble, Waldro replies that even drawing with his feet he would do better, and she challenges him to prove it. Since the stubborn old man refuses to prove anything, Closet asks Antonio to bring another canvas. The girl has gotten excited and is going to continue with this activity that she finds incredibly fun. While thinking about what to draw this time, Antonio brings a snack to the Count. Without taking her eyes off the canvas, Closet asks him to save some for her. The girl decides to paint the vase with flowers next to her, and so that Waldro can hear her. She reflects out loud on what is wrong with her painting. Unable to stand it any longer, the old man finally gives in. He approaches Closet and snatches the brush from her. He begins to correct the drawing, explaining that she used too much paint, and now the vase stands out more than the flowers. Asserting that the emphasis should be on the bouquet, he stares at the canvas for a while. When Waldro finally steps aside, Antonio and Closet approach the painting and cannot hide their astonishment. The details are so precise that there is no doubt. They are in front of a genius. Chloe heaps praise on the grandfather's talent. His drawing has improved a lot. The man silently observes his right hand, where he held the brush, and suddenly announces that he is hungry, and orders Antonio to prepare something. Chloe asks the Count not to give orders to the boy. He is her servant, not his. And suddenly, Waldro points to the protagonist and asks why she is wearing men's clothes. But when Roselia asks him to repeat what he said, the Count says he is hungry again. And Waldro no longer remembers what he said after that. Back at the duchy, Clown cannot calm down. The scare was so great that his heart is still beating fast. Antonio confesses that he also became very nervous at the thought that they had been discovered. And at that very moment, the Duke appears out of nowhere behind them, very interested in knowing why they should have been caught. He demands that they tell him what happened and how they were almost caught. But Closet tells her brother not to meddle where it doesn't concern him, and taking Antonio by the hand. She takes him away. Calling out to Dijeson, Klaus asks if Roselia told him anything. But since he replies that his sister didn't mention anything special, The Duke lets him go. After this, he heads to the palace, where a meeting with a delegation from Raeflios is taking place. Approaching Marquis Eucliode, the Duke reproaches him for being quite rude before. Johans thanks him for finding time for this meeting, and asks what business the Lord of Baltasar has with him. Eucliode has heard that the man in front of him only uses others as instruments for his own benefit. However, when the Duke suddenly asks about his romantic relationship with Roselia, Johann starts to laugh. The Marquis doesn't know exactly what happened, but he suspects something interesting is coming. He replies that Roselia and he really met after a long time, which makes him immensely happy, since he had longed for it for a long time. Seeing the seriousness with which the Duke listens to him, Johans understands that Cecilia has deeply affected this man. Meanwhile, in the duchy, the protagonist watches a painting of Closet with fascination. According to the young woman, she painted it following Mr. Waldrow's advice. The protagonist is astonished not to have noticed such a gem and doesn't understand why the original novel did not describe this facet of Closet. Suddenly, Klaus enters, places a covered cage on the table, and says that upon seeing it, he immediately thought of his sister and bought it for her. The young woman is surprised by what is happening to her brother, who instead of asking a servant to deliver the gift, suddenly does it himself. Upon removing the cloth from the cage, Closet ecstatically contemplates an incredibly adorable canary inside. The young woman blushes, embarrassed, and thanks Klaus for the gift. Then, she runs to her brother to ask for advice on how to name the bird. The heroine watches the scene dumbfounded. She never imagined the Duke smiling like that. Klaus turns to Antonio and, suddenly, invites him to have a cup of tea together. While they sit together, the Duke notices the boy's shyness and tells him to relax. The protagonist is perplexed. What caused such a radical change in him? After a brief silence, the Duke praises Antonio for his impressive progress. In less than 3 months, he only owes him 1,000 barangs. The truth is, he didn't believe de Jessen would be able to pay even half. The heroine turns away, unable to bear the Duke's smile. She is afraid of falling in love with him. And then Klaus lets slip that even after paying off his debt, Antonio can stay on the estate. He recognizes Jessen's talent and his exquisite taste for art. Antonio will need a stable income to take care of his sister, and the Duke is willing to support them, and even find a nearby estate. De Jessen refuses the offer and plans to leave once the debt is settled. The heroine didn't even think where to go, she just wanted to flee the duchy. Then Klaus asks if she and her sister will go to Raeflios. It seems logical to him if Marquis Eucliot is Roselia's lover. Antonio is surprised, but decides to take advantage and confirms the relationship. His hands tremble so much that the cup falls to the floor when he tries to put it down. Wiping up the tea, the heroine tries to understand why the Duke believes that. She doubts whether to go ahead, but Johans is kind, so she will explain. The Duke, knowing it sounds strange, says that Antonio and Roselia smell the same. The boy justifies it by saying that he uses the same soap as his sister. The Duke gets up from the armchair and advises Antonio to think carefully about his proposal one last time. The protagonist leaves the office, still wondering why Klaus suddenly became so kind. Even though she promised herself not to change again, in the end she had to do it once more. Roselia and Closet visit the Crown Princess's palace. Sitting in the garden, Lady de Baltasar enthusiastically tells the story of how Antonio fell into the water for her hat. Ibellion is glad that de Jessen is fine and asks if it's true that the Duke saved him. According to her, although it is not visible at first glance, Klaus also has a tender side. The Crown Princess laughingly reminds Closet of the time, 8 years ago, she gave her sister a live bunny. Klaus then said he would skin it and make a muff for her. In the end, Closet cried buckets, feeling sorry for the little creature. Lady Baltasar is not amused, as she was traumatized by what her brother did. To change the subject, Roselia thanks the Crown Princess for the invitation and replies that she always finds time for people she likes. And then Closet decides to ask Ibellion if it is true that those of the Raeflios family emanate an intense, natural scent. Roselia even chokes, thinking the girl was going to ask the Crown Princess about the Marquis. According to Ibellion, she only read about it in writings, so she doesn't know much, but such a lineage did exist before. Now it has almost disappeared, and even if someone inherits those traits, it is difficult to confirm. The Crown Princess heard that her family passes down methods to control the scent, and that is why there are no visible differences compared to common people. At that very moment, Marquis Euclid passes by the viewpoint and, oh surprise, spots Cecilia there. While Closet marvels at the incredible story, the protagonist thinks that Esteban's words, which she thought were ravings, were true. Johans interrupts the girls' chat and asks them to invite him for a cup of tea. The princess does not object, but awaits her friend's opinion. The Marquis apologizes for his excessive familiarity and withdraws. Closet stops him, assuring him that everything is fine. The princess invites the Marquis to sit with them. The heroine perceives a subtle scent coming from him, probably the one Ibelian described to her. Johans, turning to Roselia, asks how she is and tells her he is happy to see her again. When tea time is over, the girls return to the duchy escorted by the Marquis. Closet whispers to her friend when she had time to meet Euclid. She replies that she met him, by chance, at the imperial ball. The heroine decides to take the opportunity and talk to Johans about her supposed relationship. At that moment, he leans over Roselia and carefully removes a fallen petal from her head. He feels the strong scent emanating from the young woman, which indicates that blooming is near. She doesn't know how to control it, so the scent starts flooding everything and Roselia could be in danger. Since the protagonist doesn't understand why he touched her hair, Johans shows her the petal. He thinks that when blooming occurs, he must be by Cecilia's side, no matter what. At that very moment, the Duke passes through the hallway and, witnessing the scene, clenches his fists with jealousy and rage. Baltasar considers it quite daring to invite a guest to the mansion without informing him. The heroine was not prepared for that encounter, especially with Roselia's appearance. The Marquis apologizes for arriving unannounced. The Duke invites the guest to stay and rest. Then, turning to Roselia, he asks for a moment. But Johans suddenly blurts out that it is impossible. They were just about to talk alone, being Roselia's lover. The Marquis expects understanding from His Highness. After saying this, he turns to the protagonist and winks at her with a smile. Roselia freezes. How did Marquis Euclid know about that? Taking advantage of the occasion, Johans asks the Duke to stop being so disrespectful to Roselia. Although Klaus understands that he is defending his beloved, he reminds him that he is not in Raphelius, and that he should not provoke him in Luke Belset. Johans believes that the care of his beloved does not depend on the place, and he cares that Roselia is comfortable in any country. He states that he will not stop if someone gets in his way, be it the Duke, the Crown Prince, or the Emperor himself. The protagonist, tired of their disputes, steps between the men and orders them to stop. Seeing a soldier running towards them, she tries to usher the Marquis out, saying they are calling him. Johans, believing he has no choice, prepares to leave, but reminds Roselia that she can turn to him whenever she wants. After seeing him off, the protagonist asks the Duke what he wanted to talk about. Since Roselia is here, Klaus suggests that she join him for dinner. The young woman thinks about refusing, but upon looking up at the Duke, she sees the pleading look he gives her. Assuming that perhaps he will regret it, the protagonist agrees to dine with him. And so there they are, she, Klaus and Closet, sitting at the table. The silence in the dining room is such that Roselia even feels suffocated by the awkwardness. However, the first one to not endure it anymore is Closet, who declares that she cannot eat in this atmosphere. She asks her brother what he is doing here, now making such incomprehensible things. Without losing composure, the Duke replies with complete calmness that he simply thought it would be nice to share a meal with her and Roselia, and regrets that Antonio could not join. The heroine sarcastically comments on her brother's preoccupation, paying off debts. Klaus notices that she is eating little and offers to order something else. Seeing the brother's kindness, Closet begins to believe that he is possessed. The Duke suggests the chef prepare something special, but Roselia refuses. Closet keeps screaming that an evil spirit controls her brother, but Klaus, imperturbable, insists that everything is fine. Already in her room, the heroine is by the open suitcase. Flee! But suddenly, Klaus's voice surprises her from behind. He asks if it's normal for Roselia to leave without saying goodbye. Taking her bag, she replies that she will see Antonio on another occasion. The Duke expresses his surprise to the girl that the Marquis is not helping her pay off her debt. However, Roselia replies that it is a family matter, and Johans has nothing to do with it. Immediately after, Klaus asks about the girl's wrist after having squeezed it until it turned red. Upon learning that it is fine now, he justifies his action by saying that he got carried away by emotions. Smelling the alcohol emanating from the Duke, the protagonist comments that he never prevented her from treating her as she wished. Klaus admits it and apologizes to Roselia. The Duke confesses that he shouldn't have said those words then and deeply regrets it. But if he were the Marquis, he would pay off all his beloved's debt just to not have to share her with anyone. Looking Klaus in the eyes, the protagonist cannot believe that he has truly fallen in love with her. Cornering the girl against the wall and leaning towards her, he begs her not to leave with that man. Klaus says it in a sweet and sincere voice, which the heroine had never heard from him before. But she has no choice, so pushing the Duke away, she declares that it is time to leave. Upon turning around, she sees the look with which Klaus bids her farewell. Roselia feels how, because of her, this ruthless man has changed and become warm. However, the girl orders herself to control herself, because that simply cannot be. Upon going out onto the street, she sits directly on the ground, hugging her knees to her chest. Roselia promised herself never to fall in love with him, and now she tries to blame the dinner alcohol. The heroine decides to give herself some time, assuming that everything will return to normal. The next day, Closet and Antonio go out for a walk to enjoy the beautiful sunny day. Since Lady Balthazar couldn't ask her friend about this yesterday, she asks since when Marquis Euqueliot is her lover. The protagonist confesses that she lied to the Duke and told him she loved Iones. According to Closet, if the Marquis agreed to play along, perhaps he really likes her. He undoubtedly feels something for Roselia. There is no other explanation for so much kindness. Upon hearing the girl's conjectures, the protagonist starts making faces. Being near the Marquis is comfortable and pleasant, but she feels nothing romantic for him. The protagonist insists that this is not the case, and Euqueliot is perhaps just provoking her. Meanwhile, the Duke watches Closet and Antonio from his window, walking in the garden. He stares intently and thoughtfully at the smiling Digeson. Alejandro interrupts the Duke's thoughts, asking what His Excellency is looking at with such attention. Klaus flinches and sharply denies having seen anything out the window, but that reaction betrays him even more. The Duke accuses Alejandro of tiptoeing around his office, as if he had nothing better to do. The secretary reminds the master that he himself ordered him to classify the documents. He informs the Duke about the school construction. He mentions something about shops and residential areas. But Klaus doesn't listen, thinking about how he unconsciously looked at Antonio. And all because he looks too much like his sister. After spending the night at Count Bernaz's house, the protagonist tucks him in and leaves the room. As she closes the door, she stretches in relief, as another day of work has come to an end. However, the protagonist does not want to return to the duchy, as she doesn't know how to look Klaus in the face now. To buy some time, she decides to tidy up the Count's estate a bit. The protagonist enters Waldro's office and realizes that there is a pile of documents thrown on the floor. As she picks up the papers, she finds among them a letter from the Esquivon naval base. The letter brings news of the death in battle of Lord Ashton de Bernaz, son of Count Baldro. The next morning, Antonio approaches the Count to talk about his son. Baldro once again calls his son an ungrateful boy who doesn't bother to contact his father. Digeson decides not to upset the old man and hides the documents from him. The letter reports that Bernaz's son died in combat 6 months ago. As far as the protagonist knows, around the same time, the Count suffered a faint, and then symptoms of dementia began to appear. Looking at the old man, she thinks that perhaps not remembering anything is even better for him. When the protagonist leaves the county, lost in thought, suddenly a man runs towards her, with his face covered by a hood. As he runs past, he accidentally hits her with his elbow. The protagonist falls to the ground, but the stranger doesn't even stop to apologize, and keeps running. Looking around, the girl realizes that she is at the school construction site. And then, the memory of the incident with Dreamleaf from the original story resurfaces in her mind. It was a crucial moment that definitively separated the Duke and the Crown Prince. Dreamleaf causes strong hallucinations and an equally potent addiction, so the Empire strictly controls its trafficking. Klaus was caught trying to illegally traffic this substance, which was found at the Duke's construction site. Jumping to her feet, the heroine runs after the stranger and orders him to stop. She demands an explanation for what he was doing, as she knows that by this time the workers should have already gone home. Until now, Klaus only made money with completely legal businesses, and perhaps someone planted those illegal plants there on purpose. The heroine almost catches up with the hooded man, but suddenly he turns around and attacks her with a heavy beam. Shielding herself from the blow, she only thinks that possibly Klaus was framed. After the blow to the head, the protagonist falls to the ground, and the culprit flees. Watching him run away, Roselia thinks it is urgent to warn that someone is trying to frame the Duke. Back at the Baltasar mansion, Antonio bursts into the Duke's office, stating that it is urgent. But when Klaus is ready to listen, Dejessen hesitates, not knowing how to explain everything. Yes, the heroine knows the future, and a dream leaf is hidden in the construction, but she doesn't know how to tell the Duke that someone is framing him. How could she know? So, Antonio reports that a suspicious person was lurking around the school construction site, and they must investigate. Noticing scratches on his hands, the Duke asks what happened. Withdrawing his hand, Antonio replies that it doesn't matter right now. Knowing that Dejessen was at that construction site, Klaus sighs and tells him to stop fooling around. He orders him to go to the infirmary immediately, as Dr. Nelson should still be awake at this hour. The Duke insists that the place is well guarded and tries to push Antonio towards the doctor. And although Dejessen begs him to listen, Klaus doesn't want to hear anything until his wound is healed to avoid bigger problems. Finally, Antonio gives up and promises to go to the infirmary. But in reality, the protagonist heads to the construction site to find everything out on her own. Meanwhile, she keeps scolding herself for continuing to meddle in everything. Roselia doesn't understand why she is there, waiting for the criminal's return, if she shouldn't care whether Klaus lives or dies. Meanwhile, the Duke himself also arrives at the construction site. Despite Alejandro's attempts to convince him to return during the day, Klaus apologizes to his secretary for taking him out so late, and offers to return if he is cold. But Alejandro doesn't want to abandon his master. After all, who will be by his side if not him? The Duke goes to take a quick look at the construction site and promises to return soon. Just then, the protagonist sees the hooded man she bumped into earlier. She watches him closely, trying to discover where he hid the dream leaf. And then, Roselia sees the culprit hiding a small bag under a beam. As he flees, the criminal drops something resembling a brooch. Whatever it is, the important thing now is to collect evidence. As the heroine suspected, she finds the dream leaf under the beam, so someone is definitely trying to frame Klaus. Meanwhile, the villain who fled the crime scene realizes the loss. Returning to where he might have lost the brooch, he sees a boy leaning over the beams. Antonio turns, trying to figure out what to do now. At that moment, the construction beams under him collapse, and he falls into the void. When Dejessen opens his eyes, he is under the fallen beams next to the Duke, who is holding the bars, preventing them from crushing the boy. Hearing a loud crack, Alejandro runs with all his might to help his lordship. While trying to find his master under the rubble, a hooded man flees the crime scene. Klaus, completely bloodied, protects Antonio with his body. Dejessen sees how his body trembles under the weight of the beam that has fallen on his back. Barely holding on, Duke Klaus asks Antonio not to move. Hearing Alejandro's voice coming from above, the protagonist shouts that the Duke is injured. The secretary runs at full speed to call the workers for help. Antonio is very worried about the blood on Klaus's back. He asks if it hurts and what they should do. The Duke orders the boy to be quiet, as with his words, he only makes him lose strength. He asks Antonio not to move, because if he gets hurt, it will stress him even more. It becomes harder and harder for Klaus, but he is glad the beam fell on him, and not on Jessen, because, seeing his physical build, it seems he could break in half at the slightest blow. The protagonist notices a drop of sweat sliding down the Duke's chin. Reaching out, she gently wipes it from his face. Klaus angrily reminds Antonio that he had asked him not to move. Alejandro managed to find workers, and they are already trying, under his direction, to rescue the Duke and Jessen from the rubble. When they finally manage to rescue the injured, the secretary bombards Klaus with questions about what happened, why the building collapsed, and what Antonio is doing there. At that precise moment, Clauset arrives running at the construction site, terrified. Upon learning what happened, the girl became extremely distressed and ran to see if Antonio was okay. Dejessen states that he is fine, which he cannot say about the Duke. According to him, if it weren't for Klaus, everything would have ended very badly. Suddenly, tears begin to stream from Clauset's eyes. Antonio blames himself for everything and says he deeply regrets that the Duke was injured because of him. But the girl, telling him to stay still and that it's not his fault, approaches her brother. Klaus asks his sister to calm down and tells her he is fine, that it's time for her to go to sleep. Without stopping crying, Clauset reminds him how their father once said that his wound was not deep. Lying in bed, all bandaged, He stroked her head and asked her not to worry. Dad said the wound wasn't that deep and promised that he and Mom would recover, and they would all go for a picnic by the pond together again. In the original story, the Duke and Duchess died young in a carriage accident, and Klaus and Closet suddenly lost both parents. The mother died instantly at the scene of the accident, and the father passed away later, already at the estate, and this trauma left a mark on the girl's soul. Closet starts screaming and tells Klaus not to dare to die and leave her alone, threatening never to call him brother again if he does. The young woman looks at her brother in silence, and this angers the young woman even more. Finally, he extends his hand and strokes Closet's head. Klaus begs his sister not to say such horrible things, because he will never die or leave her alone. The young woman, with a stern expression, threatens her older brother with her fist. Then she orders both him and Antonio to return to the estate immediately, and above all, to heal their wounds. Sighing in displeasure, Closet, with feigned importance and nose in the air, is the first to head towards the mansion. Klaus and Antonio look at each other and smile, amused by her behavior. The Duke's wounds were bandaged, and he was advised to change the bandages frequently to avoid scars. According to Alejandro, Antonio only had a few scratches, and he is fine. Suddenly, the secretary remembers that the workers found something at the construction site while removing the rubble. He shows the Duke a dream leaf that someone obviously hid under the construction beams. Alejandro suggests investigating the matter to find out if someone hid the plant there on purpose. But since it is late, Klaus leaves it for later and dismisses the secretary. Alone, the Duke reflects that if things had been different, he could have ended up in the imperial prison. Obviously, someone was trying to frame him, but it is not clear how Antonio found out. Klaus reaches out his hand towards the bandages to change them, and at that moment, Dejessen knocks on his door. He came to properly thank the Duke, as he couldn't do it before, since everything happened too fast. Furthermore, he was going to tell the Duke something, but upon entering and looking at him, he blushes. The Duke is in the middle of the room shirtless, bandaging his muscular torso. Klaus doesn't understand why his appearance embarrasses him so much if he is only changing clothes. He urges him to get to the point, and Antonio takes the object that the infiltrator dropped at the construction site out of his pocket. The Duke examines the object, but the crest does not belong to any known noble family. The object resembles a badge, one that is worn on the chest, but it has no pin. There is no longer any doubt. If someone put that drug at the construction site, it is because there are bad intentions. Dejessen tries to understand what crucial detail of the original story he is missing, and if Klaus is not the villain who is trying to frame him. Suddenly, an idea strikes him, and he rushes to share it with the Duke. Antonio believes that, perhaps, it would be prudent to link this incident to Archduke Rubelio. Klaus is in shock and shouts, does he realize what he is implying? The Archduke is an unquestionable member of the royalty. Antonio must know the seriousness of his accusations. Archduke Rubelio is the younger brother of the emperor and the uncle of the crown prince, the next in line to the throne. In the original story, this man was mentioned very briefly. That is why the protagonist did not pay attention to him. According to Klaus, if anyone heard Antonio, they would hang him immediately for insulting the imperial family. Jessen understands it, but he just wanted to warn the Duke. It is better to prevent than to regret. Klaus does not deny that there is some truth in his words. According to him, Antonio and Roselia are equally unpredictable and always cause unexpected problems. After putting the evidence in the jewelry box, the Duke asks Dejessen to stop meddling in the matter. He orders him to moderate his curiosity, not to say those things again, and simply forget it. Antonio tries to reply, and that is when Klaus explodes and orders him to shut up, because this is very dangerous. One word too many, and the boy could disappear without a trace, especially after today, that he almost lost his life. Turning around and calming down a bit, the Duke advises Antonio to, for now, stay hidden here. The protagonist senses Klaus's concern, but his intentions remain a complete mystery to her. He has already saved her twice, albeit under Antonio's identity, and she still hasn't returned the favor in any way. Approaching the Duke, Antonio begs him to at least allow him to help with the bandaging. Klaus flatly refuses and asks him to take his hands off, as something like that between men only generates discomfort. Despite everything, the protagonist knows that her heart will not be at ease if she doesn't do it. And that's why she implores the Duke. Klaus finally agrees, making it a condition that Antonio takes care of everything as quickly as possible. And while the Duke remains seated, feeling uncomfortable, the protagonist bandages his wounds. Although it turns out to be more difficult than she thought, just when she is almost finished, their faces are so close that her heart starts beating fast. After another awkward exchange of glances, the Duke orders Antonio to withdraw. Although Jessen hasn't finished, Klaus sternly repeats that it is enough. Not understanding what bothered the Duke so much, Antonio bows and leaves. The protagonist finds it exaggerated to get angry like that over poorly applied bandages. Alone, Klaus tries to understand what has been happening to him lately. The idea that he might feel something for Antonio is driving him crazy. The Duke cannot believe it. Could it be that he is attracted to both sexes? But there is an even bigger problem. He cannot be attracted to both siblings at the same time. It is impossible. The next day, Klaus shows the found brooch to Alejandro. He tells his secretary that, according to Antonio, someone deliberately hid Dreamleaf at the construction site. The Duke orders an exhaustive investigation. That thing could be crucial evidence. Furthermore, Klaus demands discretion when assigning a bodyguard to Antonio. He will not leave his circle vulnerable knowing that someone is plotting to harm him. Meanwhile, the Duke will leave for the Imperial Palace for a while. Upon presenting himself to the Crown Prince, Klaus informs him about the Dreamleaf found at the construction site. He also communicates his intention to investigate and catch the culprit. After listening to him, Esteban, throwing his typical jokes at the Duke, proposes to examine the Dreamleaf he brought. Observing it, Klaus reflects on how such a promising crown prince could have changed so much. Apparently, everything started after the Empress's death. Since that day, Esteban has transformed, beginning to distrust everything and everyone. Obviously, it was a tragic event, but Klaus fought to the death for his family name. So the crown prince is nothing more than a pathetic loser. After examining the Dreamleaf, Esteban says he is pleased with the Duke's visit, although the investigation is totally necessary. Klaus doesn't know if he is truly pleased or just being sarcastic. Then the crown prince asks, out of the blue, how Antonio is. Esteban asks not to take the question the wrong way, as he only asks why he hasn't seen the boy for a while. With a mocking smile, he asks if the Duke knows anything about the lineage of the Raelios. After receiving an affirmative answer, the crown prince asks if he knows their unique scent. Baltasar doesn't understand at all where he wants to get to. And then Esteban, giving Klaus a friendly pat on the shoulder, replies that it was just a sudden thought, and asks him to send regards to Antonio. After seeing off the crown prince with his gaze, the Duke wonders when those two became so close. Esteban takes the hallucinogenic herb to his uncle and tells him that they slipped it to the Duke of Baltasar. He wants to know what Glodden of Rubelio thinks about it. The Archduke plays with the Dreamleaf in his hands and sinks into his thoughts. In his opinion, if Klaus were behind this, he wouldn't have handed the herb to His Highness. As far as he knows, the Duke is loyal to the imperial family, and it is unlikely that he is involved with illegal substances. Esteban is surprised that his uncle really believes in Baltasar's loyalty. After all, he perfectly remembers that they killed his mother. And although Glodden understands the crown prince's feelings, he reminds him that there is not a single piece of evidence that the Empress was murdered. However, Esteban cannot explain how a completely healthy person could die so suddenly. He is convinced that his mother was poisoned by an alliance of nobles to weaken the crown. The previous emperor has been dead for a long time, and they still refuse to acknowledge it. Esteban will never forgive them for that. He intends to take revenge on everyone, both the Duchy of Baltasar and the Marquisate of Erden and the entire noble league. Therefore, the crown prince instructs his uncle to watch the duchy closely. He believes that, if someone dares to rebel against the imperial family, the Duke of Baltasar will be the first. Esteban also orders not to lose sight of the crown princess, who, although cautious now, will act when they lower their guard. Placing a hand on his uncle's shoulder, the crown prince tells him that he is the only one he has left. He cannot fully express his gratitude that Glodden is still on his side. The crown prince begs his uncle to promise him that he will stay with him for much longer. The Archduke smiles at His Highness and gives him his promise. Afterwards, Glodden gets up, as he has to meet the crown princess. Upon leaving Esteban's mansion, Rubelio grits his teeth, furious at the useless people who hid the Dreamleaf so poorly. If the imperial family had known sooner, it would have been a perfect opportunity to get rid of the Duke. The Archduke believes that the idiot crown prince suspects absolutely nothing about him. But he is not too discouraged, hoping that his moment will come, and next time he will destroy them all in one blow. De Rubelio is convinced that this empire belongs to him, and only him. When Glodden goes to see the crown princess, he discovers that she is not alone. At that precise moment, Ibelian is having another meeting with Antonio. The Archduke asks who this young man is, and the crown princess introduces him as a guest from the duchy. When Antonio introduces himself to de Rubelio, the latter remembers hearing about this servant of de Balthasar. He asks de Hessen if it is true that he was the one who discovered the Dreamleaf at the school construction site, and he confirms it. The protagonist is not at all pleased that the Archduke knows who he really is. Noticing the change in Antonio's expression, the crown princess suggests ending the meeting. De Jessen leaves Ibelian's office, while Glodden announces that he has come to adjust the terms of the agreement. The heroine tries to understand why the Archduke is looking at her with that murderous look, suspecting that de Rubelio could be a criminal. While walking down the hallway, lost in thought, Marquis Euqueliot suddenly comes out to meet her. Even though the heroine is dressed in men's clothes, Johannes recognizes her immediately and calls her by her name. Completely forgetting that he must be in Antonio's role, the girl greets the Marquis and instantly realizes that she has betrayed herself. Jessen tries to justify his mistake, saying that Roselia has heard a lot about Euqueliot. Johannes listens silently to the story of how everyone constantly confuses siblings. He is trying to understand why the hell Cecilia is posing as a man. Antonio, meanwhile, expresses how pleased he is to meet the Marquis. Now Johannes understands why he couldn't find Roselia, but he still ignores her motives. It's obvious. She doesn't know that in her family, blood relatives recognize each other by scent. Shaking Antonio's hand, the Marquis declares that if Roselia is busy, it would be nice to see each other from time to time. When asked why he would want that, Johannes replies that he doesn't know, but he thinks they could get along. No matter what, he is firmly determined to always remain on Cecilia's side. That night, Alejandro arrives with a report for the Duke, to inform him of the progress of the school construction. However, Klaus is more interested in whether the secretary noticed anything strange about Antonio. According to Alejandro, Jessen met with the crown princess, and immediately after ran into Marquis Euqueliot. After returning, he chatted briefly with Lady Closet, and then visited Count Berna's. The guard could not follow him inside, so details are missing, but Antonio is taking care of the Count. The Duke knew that Berna's was mentally ill, but he doesn't understand what de Jessen has to do with it. And here Alejandro discovers something strange in the guard's report. Apparently, in the palace, Antonio met with Glodden de Rubelio. While Jessen was with the crown princess, the Archduke decided to visit His Highness. Klaus doesn't understand why Antonio ignores him, when he warned him to limit contact even with his close associates. If the Archduke finds out, the situation will become dangerous. Furious, the Duke orders Alejandro to bring de Jessen to him. And we return to the moment when Klaus corners Antonio against the wall, about to verify something. Afterwards, he asks the boy to take things more seriously if he doesn't want to die a miserable death. The protagonist stands still, looking down, not daring to reply anything. And suddenly, the Duke announces his intention to have dinner together, the three of them with Antonio and Roselia. In reality, Klaus wants to do this, hoping that sitting at the table he will understand what he really feels. Antonio replies that it is a tempting proposal, but Roselia has been very busy lately, and I doubt she has time. Furthermore, my sister already has a fiancé, and dinner with another man could be inappropriate. According to the Duke, he doesn't intend anything. He just wants to thank the siblings who diligently pay off his debt. If the problem is the Marquis, Klaus is willing to write to Roselia right now and ask her to understand him this time. Then Antonio says it's not necessary, as his sister loves new places, and now she is traveling far away. In that case, Klaus is willing to send a carriage for the lady to bring her back. In any case, the Duke asks them to let him know when it is convenient for him and his sister, and he will wait as long as necessary. Sighing, Antonio promises to discuss it with Roselia. The next day at Nadia's house, the heroine panics, thinking she is doomed. The artist advises Antonio to calm down, or he will go bald at this rate. Collapsed on the table in despair, the heroine thinks about how to split in two. And suddenly, she realizes that Nadia has the same height and build as her. Therefore, the heroine decides to talk to the artist and ask her for a small favor. At first, Nadia says she is busy, but when Antonio offers to pay, she miraculously frees up. Dejessen explains to the artist that she just has to pretend to be his younger sister. Roselia. What a surprise for the heroine to discover that Nadia already knew who Antonio really was. The artist finds the idea interesting and agrees to play along, wondering if that man is blind not to realize that brother and sister are the same person. To carry out the plan properly, the heroine leaves Nadia's house and goes to see Euclio. Antonio tells Joannes that Roselia is in trouble and asks for help. The Marquis is happy to fulfill any favor the girl asks of him. The key day arrives, and the Duke and Antonio wait for Roselia in front of the restaurant. Although Klaus wanted to eat at the mansion, Dejessen insisted that sometimes it's good to go out for a walk to clear one's head. The protagonist plans to act quickly and directly, as from the beginning, she didn't intend to give the Duke a single chance to declare himself. She hopes that today Klaus will be as absent-minded as ever and suspect nothing. Finally, Roselia appears on the other side of the street. Antonio greets her with a wave and calls her, but for some reason, she doesn't turn around. The Duke finds it strange that, for the first time all this time, he feels absolutely nothing for Roselia, who has her back turned. Just as Antonio is about to cross to look for his sister, a carriage stops in front of her, and Marquis Euclio gets out of it. Dejessen tries hard to look surprised by Johannes's appearance. Klaus, meanwhile, finds it strange that his blood used to boil at the sight of Roselia with the Marquis, but now he feels nothing. Johannes, in a low voice, asks Nadia if he can touch her to make it more credible. The artist agrees, and he raises his hand to caress the girl's hair. This entire meeting ceases to make sense to the Duke, as he realizes that he feels absolutely nothing. When the fake Roselia gets into the carriage with the Marquis, and they leave, Antonio, with feigned sadness, assumes that something urgent has come up for them. He regrets that they have to cancel the restaurant reservation, and promises to find another suitable day for the meeting. However, the Duke suggests to Antonio that they have lunch alone, since they are out. Later, sitting in the restaurant, Klaus starts to think more and more that that girl on the street was not Roselia. Looking at Antonio, he thinks about how charming he is when eating. Realizing that he finds a man cute and charming, the Duke clutches his head, refusing to believe it. Later, the protagonist meets Johannes and Nadia to thank them for their wonderful performance. Nadia asks her not to thank her, as she not only had fun, but also had the luck to collaborate with the Marquis. Since it is time for Euclio to leave, he says goodbye to the artist and Antonio, and asks them to contact him if they need his help again. Alone with Nadia, the protagonist offers her the promised payment. To her question of whether the artist has enough funds, she replies that she has no need, only that she needs to buy something with that money. That being said, Nadia suddenly starts coughing heavily again, like before. The protagonist is very surprised by this, as she thought the woman was better. Nadia repeats again that the doctor warned that it would take a long time to fully recover. The protagonist suggests she change doctors, but the artist doesn't even want to hear about it, and rushes Roselia to leave. Alone, she looks at her palm stained with blood spatters. Back at the Baltasar mansion, the protagonist cannot stop worrying about Nadia. She runs into the Duke on the way and greets him kindly. But surprisingly, Klaus does not respond and walks past in silence, ignoring Corantonia. The first time, the heroine thought the Duke was too busy, but when this happened for the third time, she understood that it was all because of that dinner. That day, Klaus barely took a bite, perhaps feeling bad about the snub. Meanwhile, his clumsy servant stuffed himself as if nothing had happened. The protagonist gets angry at the Duke's pettiness, who could have said he was hurt. Although, on the other hand, this is even good, because it is exactly what she wanted. Lying on the grass, the heroine does not see the Duke approaching stealthily. He watches Antonio, who is sleeping peacefully, while his mind is in chaos. Klaus sits nearby, thinking that nothing will happen if the boy rests a little. Looking at the lake, the Duke thinks that it all started when he feared that Antonio would die. Klaus watches the sleeping boy, trying to understand his own feelings. Suddenly, he leans over to Jessen and brushes his lips with his own. Suddenly, he hears Closet looking for Antonio in the garden. Realizing what he has done, Klaus blushes intensely. He jumps up and pretends that he was just passing by. Closet wakes up Antonio and reminds him of his promise to go on a picnic together. They don't even notice the Duke, who, hidden behind a nearby column, touches his lips with confusion and preoccupation. The next day, the protagonist leaves the estate, determined to visit Count Bernays again. The Duke, who is also planning to go somewhere, offers Antonio a ride in his carriage. Although Dijeson finds it strange, since Klaus was avoiding him, he gladly accepts so as not to walk. However, the atmosphere in the carriage is quite depressing, as the Duke remains silent the whole way. Finally, Klaus breaks the oppressive silence and asks why Antonio visits the Count so often. He asks if anyone has tried to contact Dijeson lately, receiving a negative answer. Then, they continue their journey again, in complete silence. Upon arriving at the place, Antonio runs towards Waldro, who is waiting for him by the gates. Noticing the Duke, he recognizes him as the son of the Duke of Balthasar. The Count is surprised to learn that Klaus is now the very Duke, now Baldro, whom Antonio desperately tries to get inside the house. He understands why Balthasar seems so big for a 10-year-old youngster. Klaus already says goodbye and leaves, but the Count suggests having a cup of tea. The old man fears that the Duke will scold him for not having invited him after such a journey. The three of them enter the estate, not noticing the man watching them from the doorway. Remembering that the young man liked milk cookies, Baldro asks Antonio to bring them for the guest. Dijeson reminds him that the one who likes cookies is the young lady, not Klaus, and demands that they bring something that children like. As soon as Antonio leaves the room, the Count's mood changes drastically. Baldro declares to the Duke that a dark shadow haunts that young man. Lord Bernays is sure that Klaus also noticed that someone is targeting that boy, and since he himself is too old now, he asks the Duke to take care of Antonio. According to him, Dijeson is quite a singular young man for our times. From their first meeting until now, Antonio has helped Baldro in every way possible, even though they didn't know each other before, and he stood by him even when others abandoned him. The Count doesn't know who dared to harm such a good boy and wishes him security, but he no longer has the strength to protect him. Smiling, the Duke asks the old man not to worry, since he is already carrying out all the necessary preparations on his part. Back in the room, Antonio asks what they were talking about for so long. The old man, in his usual grumpy tone, replies that he only had time to scold him for being as useless as a messenger. The Duke watches with a smile as Baldro sends Shantonio to buy the guest candies, or something sweet that children like. Dijeson repeats that Klaus is not a child and sits angrily on the sofa, refusing to go anywhere, dusting in the Count's house and putting everything in its place. The protagonist observes the Duke's behavior with surprise. She always thought that Klaus kept his distance, but he has changed a lot since she arrived. Not only does he speak calmly with Waldro, but for some reason, he even smiles. After finishing the chores, Antonio says goodbye to the Count. Klaus, who also spent the day there, asks the old man to take care of himself when saying goodbye. Waldro begs the Duke to visit him tomorrow because he wants to show him something. Seeing the Count's serious face, Klaus intuits that he knows something important. He promises to visit him tomorrow when he takes Antonio again. Later, in the carriage, the Duke shares his impressions of the visit with Dijeson. Klaus heard that the Count had dementia, but he noticed him much more lucid than expected. The Duke wonders if the old man changed after his son's death in battle. Antonio believes that is the real reason, although now Waldro doesn't even remember that his son is gone. He confesses that he decided not to bring up the topic with the Count now, and the Duke agrees with him. After a brief silence, Klaus suddenly says that, however, something interests him. But then, as if changing his mind, he turns to the window, and they continue the journey in silence. The next day, the estate servants order Antonio to take a heavy box to the warehouse. It is not the first time that the protagonist realizes how much they dislike her. The men, with a mocking smile, remind Antonio that he is also a servant like them, even if he receives special treatment. Dijeson obediently lifts the heavy box from the floor so as not to provoke them and not create unnecessary problems. The box is too heavy for the protagonist's delicate hands. Her body trembles, but she keeps carrying it. The Duke, appearing out of nowhere, snatches the box from Antonio's hands and angrily asks where he should take it. Dijeson and the other servants look at him with terror in their eyes. Klaus frowns and repeats his question. In the end, a servant snatches the box from his lordship's hands, assuring him that everything is fine, and that he will take care of it. Antonio thanks the Duke for his help, who is annoyed that he lets any riffraff order him around. Klaus suggests to the boy that he learn hand-to-hand combat with him. Since it's time to go to the Count, the Duke orders Antonio to get going, and he obediently follows him, with his head down. He understands that now, after this, the other servants will hate him even more. The Duke opens the carriage door and orders him to get in. Antonio thanks him, but points out that he doesn't really need to drive him every time, since this causes him, as a servant, some inconvenience. Klaus reminds him that he himself has business with the Count. It would be strange for two people going to the same place to travel separately. When Klaus and Antonio arrive at the Count's mansion, he does not receive them, as he always did. Jessen finds it strange and goes to the office to see if Waldro is there. Upon opening the door, Antonio screams in horror. He runs at full speed towards the old man, who is face down on the floor. Antonio begs Waldro not to leave him and screams that they urgently need a doctor. The Duke picks up a paper from the floor, next to the old man, and shows it to the boy. It turns out that the death notice for the young Count was sent to Lord Berna's for the second time. Klaus lifts the old man from the floor, throws him over his shoulder, and assumes that someone did it on purpose. It is difficult to know who it could be, but he certainly wanted to harm the Count.